All right, welcome to Computer Science S76, Building Mobile Applications. My name is David Malan. I'll be your instructor for this summer. So we have a lot of new toys up here today, so I'm going to do my best not to embarrass myself by toggling between multiple machines and hitting this screen. So please forgive if I look like a neophyte when it comes to this stuff. But we do know a little something, at least, hopefully, about mobile applications, and that's why we're here. This course is primarily focused on the world of iOS. There are certainly alternatives out there, but the summer is only so long, so we thought we'd pick one platform and focus on two aspects of it, namely mobile web application development and native application development. And let's start there. What is meant by these two distinctions? What are we about to get into this summer? OK, so browser versus standalone. So a mobile web application is one that, of course, runs within the confines of the browser, which likely means a mobile web application is written in what language? Yeah, so HTML, CSS, and then if it's an actual application, presumably there's some programming language underlying it, so not just a markup language, so something like JavaScript. So indeed, that'll be the trio of languages that we use for mobile web applications. And now native applications, they don't run inside of a browser, so where do they run? Sorry? So on the OS itself. So there's this language called Objective-C that Apple's used for some time, most recently in the context of iOS, their mobile operating system, with which you can write native applications, which are ones that once you've written the source code, you can compile them, so to speak, into object code or machine code. And that machine code runs natively on the CPU and on the operating system that's running on an iPod, on an iPad, or on an iPhone these days. So we're going to focus on both of these over the course of the next several weeks, though mostly on the native side of things, because indeed that's probably where the greatest returns are in terms of new material and challenges. But we will spend today and the first project in the course on the mobile web aspect. So before we get there, let's take a look at what we actually mean by this. So let's start with mobile web. Here is a screenshot of a typical iPhone, and you can, of course, pull up Safari on the bottom there. And when you do, you might be inclined to actually visit a website, like Harvard's here, that's mobile friendly. So the irony is if you go to harvard.edu, you don't actually get the mobile-friendly version. You get the desktop-friendly version. But if you guess and type in manually m.harvard.edu, m generally designating mobile, you do in fact get this site, which looks much more touch-friendly. So what does it take to actually make a mobile web application like this that's clearly conducive to actually interacting it with your fingers? So things are big enough to touch, text is big enough to read. What's involved in doing this? Well, you all have probably come into this course with some background in HTML and CSS, maybe a little bit of JavaScript. But to do something like this, all you need is pure HTML, a little bit of CSS, and a little bit of savvy as to what tags and what properties actually underlie the little configuration details that make things much more mobile friendly, much more touchable, much larger at the end of the day. So here's an example of Harvard's site. It may look like these things are buttons, 4 buttons here, 3 buttons down, but all these are pings or GIFs or JPEGs in image tags, IMG tags, with which you're probably familiar. They're laid out in some kind of grid fashion with a table or with a sequence of divs. And so they've just been optimized by the designers to be sort of conducive to being touched by one's finger. And the graphics have all been similarly designed in Photoshop, but they're like to fit in this interface. So at the end of the day, if we look underneath the hood at this website and look at its code, you're just going to see some fairly familiar HTML, CSS, and not all that much magic. But there probably are a few tags that underlie it that make it a little more mobile friendly, just like they do sites like these. You would just take it for granted that when you pull up a site like Gmail or m.harvard.edu or dozens of others out there that you might use, that they come up in this web mobile conducive way. But it does take a little bit of savvy. So before we dive into anything approaching the native side of things, let's take a look at HTML5. So if you've been programming HTML in some form for some time, you probably started out with earlier iterations, maybe even XHTML and various tags that have come and gone over the years. But HTML5 is now what's with us, and browser support is increasing for its several features. We won't dwell too much on the basics of HTML, because I'll assume that you largely know those. But what we will do is try to solve at least one problem. But first, some canonical HTML. There we go, my first goof. All right. There's what lies ahead. So let's go to, let's say, this slide here. All right, just as I intended. So this is a mobile website that we've made for the course, Computer Science S76. And it's got 2 links, lectures and syllabus. But odds are most of you can barely, if at all, see lectures or syllabus. And yet this is just very simple HTML. In fact, what tags have I probably used in this website? I can show off that this thing does actually work on demand. So we've used the anchor tag to actually have a link that's clickable in blue there. What other tags are probably there? What's that? So the list tag, so a UL tag for unordered list probably, an LI tag, and then the easy ones, HTML, body, head, title, and all of the other boring ones that probably underlie this page. But I haven't really told the browser that I should anticipate that this thing's going to be viewed on a mobile device. It's barely legible. And why is that? Well, most browsers assume by default, even mobile browsers running on our phones these days, that they're sized really for desktop computers. And just in case this is actually a real website with lots of graphics and text, your phone is going to show it at the default zoom level, which is not going to lend itself to actually seeing up close what the text is that you've actually marked up there. So how can we go about fixing this? What's the easiest kludge via which we can fix this problem? Enlarge the font size, right? We can deploy some CSS. We can change the font size, the font family, any number of tweaks we can make aesthetically in hopes that it actually works. Unfortunately, then, if you then view the same site on a desktop browser, if that's also your goal, then the thing's going to look like the opposite problem has happened. So we need somehow we need some way of telling the browser dynamically to size itself based on what the device actually is. And it turns out there's a way of doing this. So with one of these meta tags, which to date you might not ever have used, or if you've used them for keywords or for descriptions underneath a web page, you can actually use them for other names, namely one called viewport. So name equals quote unquote viewport. And if we give it a content or just a value of this, width equals device width, you can probably infer from this what it's going to do. It's essentially instructing the browser that it should size the web page based on the device width, not some assumption of a typical web page, which might be 800 pixels, 1024 pixels, or even bigger these days. And literally, just by putting that in the head of my web page's HTML, I end up getting an example like this with no other changes. Much more readable, sizes to a reasonable extent, and this is one of the most useful things you can do, certainly for a text-driven website, in just making things work on your mobile browsers. Now, if we go back here, it turns out there's a bunch of other things. And this might now explain why you've gone to some mobile, unfriendly websites and have been driven nuts by the fact that you can't do what on some mobile websites on your phone? So you can't zoom. No matter how you try to pinch and zoom, it just doesn't work, frankly, because some idiot has disabled it by way of one of these meta tags by specifying that the minimum scale or the maximum scale of his or her website is, for instance, 1.0. That's the maximum and the minimum via which you might want to scale it. Now, the upside of doing something like this is that the site is probably going to look exactly the way the designer intended. The downside, of course, is that if your eyes are not consistent with the designer's vision, you're not even going to be able to override that setting. So some value, but also a frustration. So do bear in mind, too, that just because things work well for you on your own phone doesn't necessarily mean your users are going to be as enamored. But by far, the most useful at first glance for us would be something like this, and just solving that particular problem. All right. So let's take a look then at a more generalized web page. Let me see if I can master this yet. So here, I propose that this is the simplest possible web page that we can make in HTML5 that validates and at least has some bare minimum of content. So for those unfamiliar with HTML5, turns out it's probably simpler than the flavor of HTML with which you've been familiar. One, the doc type is no longer the atrocious, unmemorable thing that it was for some time with HTML4, with XHTML. It's quite simply open bracket, bang, doc type, HTML. And then below that, you actually have the body of your web page. So this is called the doc type declaration, the document type declaration. And all this really is a signal, a hint to the browser that's reading the contents of this .html file, what version of HTML it is. Because if you've been designing pages for the web for some time, you've probably run into various headaches with Chrome or Firefox or IE or other browsers because they all behave slightly differently. You might have come across something called quirks mode. And quirks mode essentially dictates how a browser interprets certain patterns of HTML. And long story short, it's this doc type that hopefully these days will increasingly kick browsers into a standards compliant mode so that your pages work more consistently across multiple browsers. All right, but this here is a representative web page, but we can do more than this. Suppose that we actually want to infuse a bit of stylization. We can add this line here in yellow. Functionally, what happens now when a web browser visits a web page containing these contents as it parses the file, top to bottom, left to right? Tell a story, if you could, just in your own words, somehow involving the network, somehow involving whatever this yellow tag is, that explains, for those less familiar, what this line of yellow text is doing functionally. OK, good. So it loads the file, styles.css, from the server, which turns out is just a text file. And in that text file is, as you might have guessed, CSS, or cascading style sheet rules. It does load it synchronously, top to bottom. So there is, in fact, an order to the tags in HTML, so that if you load a file here and then another one here, you can, in fact, assume that B is going to be loaded after A, which certainly has its advantages, though we'll see some problems that can nonetheless arise when it comes to this sort of worry about synchronization. This relation here is just telling the browser that the relation of this file to the rest of the HTML here is that it's meant to be a style sheet, so it should somehow be applied. And so inside of this styles.css file is your typical rules for fonts and colors and borders and all of that. And they are then applied to all of the elements, all of the tags subsequently in this web page. So that, too, is probably familiar, but we'll use this to our advantage as time passes, certainly to stylize things and perhaps solve some additional problems that might arise. In fact, let's go ahead and propose this. This website that we have here is pretty damn uninteresting. All we have is a super simple text-based website for the course. Not all that compelling, even though if we click through these various links on the course's website, we would actually get to the PDFs and the content that we want. But let's see if we can't stylize this a bit more so that we can make a web application look more like it's a native application, even though I have no idea yet how to write a single line of Objective-C. So let's try to make this look more like an actual application. So to do this, let me offer a brief aside on the ways in which you can approach development of web-based applications on your own Mac, presumably, but the same holds true for PCs. Whenever you start writing in JavaScript code, if unfamiliar, you often trip over a security feature of browsers, whereby if you try to run a JavaScript file locally that's living on your own hard drive, it's not going to run because the browser's trying to protect you against something that could very well be malicious. So you can work around this by changing Chrome settings or changing Safari's or your various browser settings. Or we can solve this problem by just introducing an actual web server. Now, it would be a pain if we all had to go out and buy a commercial web host and maybe a domain name and actually put all of our files for the course and for this first project on some remote server. But we can actually replicate that idea even without having internet access ultimately by just running a web server on our own computer. So what I'm going to propose that you do for this first project, which we'll talk about later, but what I've done here in advance is I've downloaded some free software called XAMPP, X-A-M-P-P. And this is free software that actually exists for Mac OS, Linux, Windows, and probably a couple of other operating systems that once you figure out how to navigate its somewhat cryptic pages of links, you can get down to the download page and download, in this case, the universal binary for Mac OS. And as an aside, for any projects, we would point you in this direction explicitly. You don't have to memorize all of these little details. But long story short, once I download this program, run it on my local computer, it will install free software called Apache. Apache is a very popular web server software that's used all throughout the world, and you can run it on your little old laptop in addition to PHP and MySQL, which also comes with XAMPP. But what's nice about this is that it gets you up and running super fast, even without having to tinker with your Mac's own built-in settings. So I did this in advance, and I ran the installer, and what that gives me is a program called the XAMPP control panel. So I'm going to go ahead and load this file here, and I'm going to get a very simple two screens. One is just a reminder of how to get started with this thing, and the other is just this little control panel via which I can start Apache. And we're not going to bother using FTP or MySQL. All we need is a place to put our files. I'm being prompted for my password there, and I should now see a green light, which indicates that a web server is running on my computer. Unfortunately, my computer here is not on the public internet. I don't even know what its IP address is, and it definitely doesn't have a domain name. So how do I go about accessing with a browser? Let's forget about phones for the moment. The web server that's now running on my particular laptop here. Yeah. Yeah, so it turns out that all computers that are running web servers are configured with a default name, and that name is usually localhost. So if I pull up a browser, I happen to be using Chrome, but I could use Safari or whatever else I have on my own Mac here, and I do http://localhost, one word, and then hit enter, what I'll see is this default page. So this is coming from a web server. It just so happens that that web server is running where? Okay, on my own laptop. Has nothing to do with the internet. I could unplug my cable now. I could turn off the Wi-Fi, and I could still actually interface with this development environment. And so that's what we're going to use it for. You don't strictly have to do this for the first project, but this is a nice and quick and dirty way of getting yourself up and running with a web server. So now we can get back to focusing on the web stuff and the development thereof. So what I'm actually going to do next is I'm going to grab the distribution code for tonight's lecture. So if I go to CS76.net, if you have trouble getting on Wi-Fi during the break, we can log in as ourselves if need be, or you can use your Harvard University ID and PIN. But we'll take a break in a little while and can field those kinds of questions. If we go to the course's website and go to lectures, I myself am going to scroll down to source code. I'm going to download a zip of that source code. Once I unzip it, it's going to end up on my desktop, and it's going to be a directory called source-0. And in there is all of tonight's examples in advance in case we want to pull up something that's been pre-written. And what I'm going to do now, for those less familiar, let's see. Actually, I'm going to do this the easy way. I'm going to open up my Finder. I'm going to go ahead and find my own personal jharvard directory. And I'm going to create in this directory a folder called Sites. Now, I had no idea that I was supposed to create a folder called Sites until I read this little cheat sheet that popped up automatically when XAMPP was installed. Now, tragically, there's a typo in the little cheat sheet here, and it says create a folder called Sites-folder. There should be no dash. There should be no folder. It's just a folder called Sites. But now that I've done this, anything I put in there is going to be accessible on that web server running locally as though I had put it there via FTP or SFTP. All I'm going to do is start putting my files in there. So for simplicity, what I'm going to do is drag my source-0 directory into my sites directory so that for the rest of tonight, everything is in that folder. And now I argue that it's accessible via my browser. So let me prove that. Let me go back to my browser. Let me go to http://localhost. Unfortunately, I still see this default screen, and XAMPP has taken it upon itself to redirect me even more deeply into the server. But I'm going to say no. I want to go to ~jharvard and then hit enter. And now I see the contents of John Harvard's sites folder. And so what's in there now is my source-0 directory. And now we can resume our look at this really poorly implemented website for the course now that we have a web server running locally, now that I've copied the distribution code for tonight into that public directory, and now that I've pulled up the appropriate URL in my browser connecting to that local web server. All right. That was perhaps a lot that was new. Again, the project specification will recap any details you need to repeat yourself. But any questions, conceptually or technologically, as to what we just did? Yeah. Sure. They do. So is this installing or just activating it or enabling it? This, I believe, comes with its own installation of Apache. So the little white lie I'm telling here is that macOS actually comes with its own instance of Apache. The upside of using XAMPP is that it works the same across various versions, Lion, Mountain Lion, of macOS. So there's many fewer technical difficulties that we've run into than having everyone turn on Apache, which is not turned on by default by Apple. And this way, too, when you upgrade macOS, XAMPP should not break on you because everything's isolated to one folder. Yes? So I don't know why I think my Apache is on. Okay. Somehow I got a site folder inside my folder thing. Okay. I can't open another site folder, so now it's not working. What should I do? OK. You have a sites folder called SITES. Yeah, exactly. And what's inside of that? Oh, I wonder if that ended up in, I have another account on this laptop, and maybe that guy got that. OK, so I think it's safe for you to delete the images folder, delete the index.html folder, and then you will be in the state that I'm in by dragging the source directory into that folder.
So I'll just keep that sites folder.
Keep the sites folder, empty it, though, and just put source0 in there. That just sounds like it's sample code that comes with XAMPP when you install it in the default account, which I did not do. Then you have something else that's doing that. Let me propose that we will focus on that one-on-one at the break. How about? All right. Excellent. See, corner case. So second white lie I've told tonight is that this does not simplify things. All right. Other questions? Other questions? All right. OK, so let me do this. In our source0, whether or not you're using XAMPP or just following along visually or using whatever other web server you prefer to run on your own laptop, I'm going to go into my CS76 directory, and I'm going to go to the HTML directory, where here I see, albeit in a desktop browser, the exact same poorly designed website that we saw a moment ago in that screenshot of an iPhone. And indeed, if I right-click on here and choose View Page Source, or Control-click, on your white background, you'll see that here's the source code for this page. And here we have some very simple HTML. As predicted, there's an unordered list, as you said. There's a list item. There's an h1, a body, and all of this. And there's also this meta tag. And that's what makes things look better within the confines of this browser. But can we improve the aesthetics still? Well, let me go back and go into this CSS directory. And voila, what a pretty looking website now. And we've done this entirely by using CSS. And it does look, up until 2 weeks ago when Apple decided that all of iOS was changing aesthetically, this looks like what? An iPhone. Well, if we at least size it to the appropriate size. So let me go ahead here. Doesn't that look like your iPhone? So it kind of does, with the typical menu at the top and this sort of tabular list of menu options. And indeed, if I go ahead and click this, we see the sub page, which is Lecture-0 or Lecture-1. And if I keep clicking, I'll see more. But what did we not get? What features did not just happen on the screen? There's no animation, right? If you're a fanboy or girl of iOS and Apple more generally, you know that it's these little touches, like the sliding from side to side, that sort of makes the experience feel the way it typically does. But this, let me go back and do it again. If I hit the back button and then click Lectures again, it just flips like a normal web page. So we're sort of mimicking the aesthetics of iOS, but we haven't really recreated it. So how could we go about getting some form of animation? Well, we probably need some more sophisticated CSS or some JavaScript, some actual logic to move content from side to side. But before we do that, let's go to the source of this page just to get a sense of what was going on here. So this is the source for this page. And if I maximize my window and zoom in here, there's only one line of code that's different. What jumps out at you? Yeah, so there's just the link tag up here, href equals ios.css. The relation is style sheet. So let's see what that is. Now, as you probably know from web development, I can just go up here, and I can say ios.css, enter, and I can see this page. And we won't dwell too much on the details here, but here's where I'm setting some font stuff and some margins. H1, so that was the title of the web page that said CS76. We have a background color that I chose to mimic what Apple itself uses for its default blue shade. We're using a background image here to actually do a gradient. What does -WebKit-gradient mean? Most CSS properties and values don't begin with dashes. Yeah, it's a browser prefix. What does that mean?
So some of the newer CSS properties are different by browser. So I can't remember. I think WebKit is Safari, or is it Firefox?
WebKit is Safari and Chrome. Yep. Exactly. And MOZ is Firefox for Mozilla. So that's exactly right. There's often unsupported or new up-and-coming features of CSS that the various browsers begin to implement on their own. But if they don't necessarily adhere to a standard, or if it's just a browser-specific feature, they'll typically prefix that property or that value with a dash, then their unique identifier. WebKit is the engine that underlies Chrome, at least right now in Safari. -MOZ is the same thing for Mozilla. So this just means this is not a feature that's going to work probably specifically on IE or on Firefox. But that's fine, because we're narrowing our focus for now just on WebKit or Chrome in this case, but it would work on Safari as well. And then I'm going to wave my hand at the rest of the details, but suffice it to say that if we tinkered enough with the CSS, even starting from a clean slate, we could replicate this iOS-looking website so that it ultimately looks like the familiar UI. But we don't get any of that scrolling with which users are familiar. So let's go back into one last directory, and let's introduce a framework here that's called jQuery Mobile. So you're probably familiar with jQuery if you know any JavaScript. If not, we'll dive into a bit of it tonight. But what you might not be familiar with are various frameworks for actually helping with the development of mobile-based websites. So if we look to pass this example here, we'll mention 3 tonight. So jQuery Mobile, as the name suggests, is a jQuery library, very popular library that's specifically geared around mobile user interface details. So we'll glance at some of its capabilities now. PhoneGap is another framework that we won't look at tonight, but PhoneGap is sort of this best of both worlds, whereby it's a framework, so downloadable code that someone else wrote, that you can use to implement native applications using HTML and JavaScript. So you don't even have to know Objective-C yourself. And we'll peel back that layer eventually, but for now, know that someone else has taken the trouble to figure out how to write the bare amount of Objective-C code that then embeds the equivalent of a web page inside of a native application so that we can just write web-based code, but still put it in the App Store, give it an icon on the home page so that it actually feels more like a native application, even though it's running somewhere else, typically on some web server. So that's another framework of interest. And then Sencha Touch, which is similar in spirit to jQuery Mobile. It helps us make aesthetics that are mobile friendly, but it's definitely a more complex framework than jQuery Mobile. So we'll just focus on the first of these. So if I go back to my other screen here, and I go into the framework sample code for today, now we have an UI that looks almost the same, but there is a little something that's different. Anyone recall what was absent last time? Yeah, so these little iOS-looking arrows. And if we go ahead and click on this row, notice that it's also highlighting just a little bit, which is nice, at least in the desktop environment. Now we have a little bit of sliding that goes on. So that, too, is pretty nice. But let's dive a bit deeper. We'll come back to this in a week or two, but I have in advance installed an application called iOS Simulator. So this is software that Apple distributes with Xcode, which is their integrated development environment for writing iPhone applications and Mac software. And if I pull it up here, it looks like this. So it looks like the screenshots I've been using earlier. And if I go up to Safari and click here, so even though it looks like a phone, I'm controlling everything with my keyboard and touchpad here. I'm going to go to http://localhost//jharvard. Damn it, what a bad mobile website. So why is this page so small all of a sudden again? So whereas up until now, all of the examples we've been looking at were written by me, and I included that meta tag, this particular page was generated automatically by whom? This is just a directory listing. Let me zoom in. So if you hold down, and we'll get to this in a couple weeks, if I hold down Option when clicking, I can pretend to have 2 fingers on my laptop screen. And then I just have to kind of scroll to get back to where I want at the top. So there's the text we were looking at. Who generated this directory listing? Yeah.
Apache?
Yeah, it was Apache. So much like you've seen on the internet, any web server, if you go to a folder that has the appropriate permissions, will just show you all of the files in that particular directory. Apache's doing that. Apache doesn't know I'm on a mobile device, and whoever wrote the Apache code didn't know or care about this meta tag for the viewport settings, so it's just super small. So at least when navigating these folders for Apache, we're going to get this annoyingly small screen. But that's OK. Let me just deal with it for a few moments. Go into my CS76 directory, zoom in again, move it over here, and then go into Framework. And now it does look a lot more like a native iOS application, right? So we're not just fooling by using Chrome. This is the actual simulator, and it would work the same on your phone. The only catch is my phone probably can't talk to my laptop unless I jump through some hoops to get the Wi-Fi to cooperate to make that work. But now let me go ahead and click on Lectures, just as I did before. Let's click Lecture-0. Damn it, I've paid a price again. What's happening? Yeah. Yeah, so I'm loading a new page, and as you might have just noticed in using an iPhone or an iPod Touch for some time, anytime you click a link on a new web page, the default Safari behavior inside of an iPhone or an iPod Touch is to very briefly show you the address bar because the URL is changing. Then it will push it away if you so choose. The problem is that there goes our mimicry of an actual native application. So again, we've paid this price. But someone argue in favor of nonetheless proceeding to implement, say, the course's website using HTML, CSS, maybe some JavaScript without ever touching or learning Objective-C. Works on all devices. It would work on an Android phone. Windows Mobile phone wouldn't look like it belongs on either of those devices, but it would certainly still work. Speed of development. Sort of 15 minutes later, we're done with the course's website, so we don't even have to look at a line of Objective-C, and it will be more complex. What's that?
Maintenance of different. You don't have to be changing like every single native app you have.
Yeah, exactly. It's a lot easier to update because even though I'm using this local web server right now, if you imagine just uploading that to the real internet and some commercial web host, I can just upload my code in one central place and no one has to update their native software. They don't have to go into the App Store to run an update. It's just anytime they visit my page, it's just going to be the way I intend it. So that's a lot of arguments in favor, but we are paying some prices. There's the aesthetic blips that are happening, whether we use CSS or even a little bit of JavaScript. There is going to be some latency. In fact, one of the biggest complaints against making apps web-based is that they just tend to feel slower. If you're a Facebook user, up until a year or more ago, a lot of the Facebook application, even though it looked like a native application, was using embedded Safari windows inside of it and grabbing content from Facebook's web servers, which is nice because they're already very good at serving up web content, and all they had to do was implement a minimum amount of code to wrap those web pages. But a lot of people, maybe you among them, griped about the speed of the application. And over the past year or more, it's gotten much faster because there's a lot more native code. So just some of the trade-offs to consider. Yeah?
No hardware feature access like the apps normally.
So that's another good one, too. And we'll come back to that later in the semester. But there's some really cool hardware underneath the hood in these iOS devices, right? You have things like a compass, you have an accelerometer, a gyroscope, and other hardware still. And some of that hardware is just not accessible to JavaScript or to a web browser. That's slowly beginning to change. And you can access more and more via JavaScript, and we'll see a little bit of that tonight. But there are some things that are beyond your reach. And that's a big one, too. The fact that you can put a native app in the App Store, whether for free or for some number of cents or dollars, is pretty compelling because it's hard to convince anyone to buy or pay for access to a website in the same way that they do something through the App Store. Yeah?
Could you put this into a frame, maybe? And then when you click on it, it wouldn't change the URL.
Good question. Could you put the mobile website into a frame, an iframe, or an actual HTML frame so that it's the URL of the innermost frame that's changing? Yes, you could. The only thing is the URL at the top will never change, and maybe that's OK, but then you'll lose the ability to deep link to specific pages. But a good workaround. All right, so let's just take a quick look at how we implemented this jQuery mobile version. We won't spend much time on it. You'll be welcome to use it for the first project, and its documentation online is ample. But let's take a look at the underlying source code for that third and final incarnation of the super simple course website. Notice at the top, we've added another CSS file. This one happens to belong to jQuery mobile itself, so I just read that off from the documentation. We've got our meta tag, just like before. I've got a script tag, this time importing jQuery. And if unfamiliar with jQuery, or if unfamiliar with JavaScript itself, we'll come back to that shortly tonight. And then one other script tag referencing this jQuery mobile site. And then if we scroll down below, you'll actually see that I'm making use of a pretty handy HTML5 feature. So what attributes are jumping out at you at perhaps being completely new?
The data-role.
Yeah, so data-role. That's not an actual valid HTML attribute. And what else? Data-theme. That's pushing it further. That, too, is not a standard attribute in HTML5, but this is actually a feature of HTML5. If you prefix an attribute with data hyphen, you can create any attributes you want. and they will not be flagged as invalid by a validator. The browsers won't choke on them. So this is a way of storing metadata often inside of your web page in a way that's going to be very accessible via something like JavaScript, but without resorting to hacks and coming up with your own tags and your own attributes, which the world did do for some time with HTML4 and XHTML, which often made browsers unhappy. So this is like a nice way of including metadata alongside your own data. But as for what jQuery Mobile is doing, well, why did I put data role? Why did I put data theme? I just read the documentation for jQuery Mobile. And jQuery Mobile essentially told me to make one div for each of the screens that I want to exist in that faux application, the first one being the home page, the next one being the lectures page, the third one being the Lecture-0 page. So I just have a div here, including some links. And if we keep scrolling down further, you'll see another bunch of content, another page, so to speak, for lectures. And so in short, the folks at jQuery Mobile decided to leverage these arbitrary data attributes to create their own markup language, still using valid HTML5. And what do you think their JavaScript file does upon being loaded into this page, for those familiar already with some JavaScript? How does jQuery Mobile turn this HTML into the user interface we saw as this? What would you do if you were a library written in some language called JavaScript that's being loaded into the web page at the top, and you know that lying ahead of you is markup that looks like this? What does jQuery Mobile presumably do to turn this into that? So if I were jQuery Mobile, I would probably search through the web page somehow, looking for all divs that have what associated with them? A data role of page. Not asking you how to do this, just high level conceptually. So if I were jQuery Mobile, I'd probably do some kind of search of the whole web page, looking for divs that have a data role of quote unquote page. And then I'm going to do something aesthetically, probably involving some CSS, to create that rectangle that looks like a screen of a native application. And I'm going to do that again and again and again for each of the pages that are defined in here. And meanwhile, anytime I encounter a div who has a data role of header, for instance, well, that's when I'm going to deploy some of that nice gradient with the blue shading. And I don't know how I'm going to do that, but at least at a high level, that's all this library is doing. And so what's nice about jQuery Mobile is that you don't even need to know JavaScript to use it. You need to just follow their directions and mark up your own content using this div approach with these data attributes. Sencha Touch, by contrast, one of the other frameworks I mentioned, very much the opposite. You instead write a whole lot of JavaScript code to create your user interface. jQuery Mobile is meant to be much more lightweight and much simpler. Yeah?
Does it then either get confusing or pigeonholing? Because if you have these frameworks, you have to learn how to get your pages to work within an individual framework. It's not confusing to remember, okay, how did I do that with Sencha as opposed to jQuery? Or then maybe I invest in jQuery and 2 years from now it's abandoned, it's like not a useful standard and it's something else is hot. It's not dangerous.
So it's a good question. Let me summarize as, doesn't this get confusing or doesn't this paint you into a corner if things change over time, or you just have to remember all of the various aspects of some fairly proprietary, if open source, design? Short answer, yes. And that's sort of one of the trade-offs you make, whether or not you implement something entirely on your own, using pure, raw HTML, your own CSS, your own JavaScript code, or you try to save time and stand on the shoulders of other people who hopefully have a good community behind them, who have good documentation behind them, to save yourself the hour, the 10 hours, the 100 hours that it would otherwise take just to kind of come up with this overarching framework. So short answer, yes. It's definitely a downside, but if it means you can finish the project in 10% of the amount of time, that too could be compelling. You could implement it 10 times over the next few years as things change. But definitely a challenge overall. Other questions? Yeah?
It looks a little bit like you define all the pages on one HTML page, actually, from this example.
Indeed.
That's something that's always the case with jQuery Mobile?
With jQuery Mobile, at least with this particular user interface that I've chosen, yes, all of the HTML and all of the pages are in one arguably big HTML file. And the motivation for that isn't largely so that you can do the seamless transitions with as little latency as possible. If you instead had to fetch more content with every transition, you might introduce a second, maybe even 2 seconds or more of delay, and that would make it feel even less like a native app. You can do that, and you can tell the browser to go fetch those pages dynamically, which frankly is necessary if you had more than 3 pages. Maybe you had 3,000. You just wouldn't want to send a 10 megabyte file down. But that, too, is a trade-off. And you have to decide where the line is between convenience and size. Good question. All right. So let's pluck off a few smaller details, smaller features of HTML5 that we can leverage here in order to make pages all the more mobile friendly. So if I switch back to this screen here and move us ahead to here. There we go. So here's a new one, another meta tag. So Apple has made ample use of this meta tag, which again today some of you have probably never used, or you've used it for some search engine optimizations. So here is one called Apple Mobile Web App Capable. If its content is quote unquote yes, what do you think this means? It is indeed mobile web app capable. What does that actually translate into? So most iPhone users don't actually do this, but you might know that if you're visiting a web page in Safari and you decide, wow, I really like this website, I want to return to it in the future, you can either, one, bookmark it, which is very 1990s style, or what else can you do if you've ever actually done this? What's that? So you can actually add it to the home screen. So if I go to, let's go back to my iOS simulator, which again we'll have you download in a week or two's time. And I go back to my directory of code. Let me go back, and let me go into tonight's. Well, that would spoil the surprise of what I see here. Yes? Fix that later. So if I go into my HTML5 page, folder, and scroll down here, and I go to, let's say, app.html. This is a super simple app. I spent like 5 seconds making it. All it has is an image tag. But I really like this image, and so I want to not only bookmark it, I actually want to have an icon on my home screen that forever shows this icon complete with the glistening Apple sparkles that makes it look like a very three-dimensional button. But how do you do that? Well, let me go to the same page in my browser, just so I can zoom in on it over here. And you'll see the same boring website, but underneath the hood in the source, notice that I've included this. And I've also jumped the gun and also included this, which, aptly named, makes the Apple Mobile Web App status bar style, quote unquote, black. So instead of getting the default blue or some other color, I just want the status bar at the top of my Safari instance to be black in this case. So if I go to my mobile browser and click on this icon here, which any iPhone user has, notice here in the middle, I have an icon, Add to Home Screen. If I did not have that mobile-friendly feature enabled, we couldn't do this. I'm going to go ahead and add this to my home screen. It's called Harvard App. It's pulling that from the title tag of the web page. And now it's here on my desktop. And now I have an icon on my desktop. So I can now forever get back to this app by clicking this. And notice the status bar is black. And notice, you can't quite see my fingers doing this, but if I click on the screen or touch the screen and try to drag down, what is absent? Yeah, so the address bar, the URL bar that's usually there. But this is Safari. But it's mimicking the idea of a native application by not revealing to me that it's Safari. But the only reason it did that was because in my HTML, I proactively, if verbosely, told the browser that it is mobile web app capable. So that's all that meta tag does. And there's a bunch of others that do similar tweaks to your interface. The status bar style we just saw. The Apple Touch icon can also be defined here. So if you define Apple Touch icon to be some ping, and there's actual pixel specifications you can read up online or just match the one that we included here, that's how you can specify what icon shows up. So it's not the default fav icon or whatever black and white icons there by default. You can do a pre-composed one. So if you really don't like Apple's sort of three-dimensional glistening of your icons, which they add for you to your icon, you can say, I have a pre-composed ping, which means I'm really good at Photoshop. I made the three-dimensional button myself. Don't add additional gloss to it. So there's that feature as well. And then startup image. If you have a really crappy website that takes a really long time to load, you can show the user an image as it's loading up. It isn't necessarily a bad website. It might just be one that has to request a whole lot of data. If Gmail, frankly, needs to request a lot of data so that you can begin interacting with your folders and labels and your inbox. So Gmail, for instance, might have an icon implemented in this fashion here. So any questions on those more aesthetic tweaks that you can apply? All right, so where does that leave us? In order to get that slightly more dynamic interface, even though it was imperfect with jQuery Mobile, we added this last line of yellow text in a language called JavaScript. Some of you, many of you might not even know JavaScript, or at least the aspects of it that we're going to leverage for mobile. But let's pause here, take a look at the course itself before diving back into actual development. So this is building mobile applications. What does that actually mean? The prerequisites for the class, as you might have seen in the course catalog, are simply these: prior programming experience in any object-oriented language. So that could be something like Java, C++, C#, or any number of other languages. But the goal is to have students in this course have comfort already on the way in with the notion of classes and objects and instance variables and class variables, even if you know some of those things by different names. So if you're on the fence about your preparedness for the course, or not sure if what you learned is consistent with our expectations, during the break that we'll take in a bit, or at the end of this class tonight, do come up to chat with me or others of the staff who I'll introduce in a bit to see if we're on the same page as you, so that frankly, you don't have a bad experience over the next several weeks simply because you don't have the requisite knowledge. 6-7 weeks is going to really fly by, and if you're trying to learn the prerequisites for the course while trying to follow the course, it could certainly be more than an arduous task. So touch base with us if unsure. Comfort with HTML and CSS. If you didn't really bat an eye at anything we just did, that's good. If you're unfamiliar with HTML or CSS, it's probably not going to be ideal, but in fairness, we'll spend just a week or two on the mobile web aspect of the course. So if you're really here and fired up about the Objective-C and the iOS aspect, talk to us too during the break or after about exactly what you do or don't have as experience. You don't, as you've perhaps inferred, need an actual iPhone, iPad, or iPod for the course. You can do everything in the confines of a simulator. You do pay a price for that, in that you can't have access to like the accelerometer. So like even shaking your laptop's not going to do anything to the simulator. So you do not have quite as much functionality. But if you do have an iOS device of some sort, you can use it for the course, certainly to test your mobile apps, but also your native apps. The catch is that Apple doesn't like to let us install software rewrite on our own hardware unless we pay Apple for that privilege. So you actually typically need to sign up for what's called an iOS developer account, which typically is $99. If you plan on doing iOS development after the course, so 7 weeks hence, it's probably a good thing to sign up for anyway, even right now, so that you use your Apple ID, so that you can download betas. For instance, I'm running iOS 7 on my phone already because it's accessible to people who are in the developer program. But if you think at the end of the semester you're not going to try to put something in the App Store and you therefore don't really need access for a year, it's an annual fee, we have an academic account which won't let you submit to the App Store, but will let you install software that you write on your computer onto your phone or your iPad or iPod. So we'll set you up with that in a couple of weeks' time, and we'll ask you for your Apple IDs and more at that point. So you don't have to pay for anything. You don't have to sign up for anything. But if you're going to be doing this for the next year, you might as well do it sooner rather than later, so you don't have to transition from our account to yours in a couple of months' time. Any questions on prerequisites? All right, so expectations, pretty straightforward. To attend all of the lectures and labs, more on those in just a moment, and submit all of the projects, more on those in a moment. Lectures, this is lecture. The focus will be on 1 week on web apps, namely this one, with a project that itself will take 2 weeks, and then 5 of the course's weeks on native applications, Objective-C, iOS, and related features thereof. This is an incomplete list of the topics and the concepts that we'll be looking at. We'll go into more detail over the coming weeks as to what it means to develop native applications. We definitely will not cover the entirety of the iOS SDK. As Apple likes to say, They just released another 1,500 APIs as of 2 weeks ago with iOS 7. There's thousands of APIs for them means method or variable, apparently. But the API itself is very rich. There's things like the map SDK with which you can embed maps, and there's the touch interface, and there's a storage layer, there's a database layer, and all sorts of ancillary ones. What we'll do in our time together over the summer is try to focus on really the most fundamental and the ones that are most representative of other SDKs, so that when you decide to write your own application, even if we never, for instance, use the gyroscope, at least the framework and the mental model will be similar from aspects of the language that we did do. Whoops, let's just zoom out for a moment and then zoom back in on labs. So what are labs? So per the course catalog, labs are going to be the hands-on aspect of the course that'll take place same time, but on Wednesdays of each week, led by the course's teaching fellows. And these will be opportunities for you to bring your laptops as well. We'll meet not here, but in a more classroom-structured environment across the hall and set up workstations for everyone. And it will be a mixture of hands-on opportunities to explore recent materials, so things similar in spirit to what we did tonight, to explore the week's projects, and to get some hints and tips and tricks as to how to dive into those, and also an opportunity for one-on-one Q&A with the course's staff, generally toward the end of those labs. We'll reserve some time for office hours-like environments so you can work on your projects alongside classmates, but have the support structure of some of us there to field questions for you. The website is here, as you might have found already, cs76.net. Discuss is the web-based tool that we'll use over the course of the summer to interact. Rather than rely on email, which ends up going only to us and back to you, we'll generally point you toward Discuss, which is the course's discussion forums. You can still post questions to the staff privately there. There's a link on the course's website to Discuss. And what we'll ask that you do for the first project is say hello to your classmates. So if you'd like to get ahead, there's a general category in the Discuss boards, and you're welcome to say hello, a little something about yourself, and perhaps why you are interested in iOS development. There's more. Okay. Projects. So the projects are really where you'll get your hands dirty in the course and retain the most, and I think learn the most. There'll be 3 total projects. 2 of them are our choices of specifications. We will specify exactly what the challenges are. The third one, though, will be your choice for you to propose to the course's staff and then design and implement your very own project. The first 2 that are signed, one will be themed mobile local, more on that Wednesday, but it will involve using browser's geolocation API, using open data sets, and mashing things together into an interface that allows users to explore news and weather, all based on their current location. Evil Hangman, meanwhile, will be an implementation in iOS of Hangman, but much more evil than you're used to, whereby rather than just have you guess the letters that the computer is thinking of, which is a very boring game once you're a few years older than when you probably last played it, the Evil Hangman version of this cheats, such that any time you guess a letter like E, the computer, or in this case your phone or iPad or iPod, is going to change the word it was thinking of and re-choose a word that's the same length but that has no E's. And when you proceed to guess A, it's going to throw away the word it was thinking about and make sure it has no E's or A's. And when you choose C, it's going to make sure the word it's thinking of is still the same length but has no E's, A's, or C's, until finally it beats you by coming up with the word like dog, which you should have thought of, but damn it, the thing was cheating the whole time. And so implementing this and calling it not Evil Hangman, but Hangman, and having your friends play it is a wonderful way to make them think that they're awful at Hangman. All right, so more on that to come. Grades in the course is fairly straightforward. Performance in the course will be determined by the projects. No exams, no attendance records, nothing beyond the course's actual workload and immersion. We'll evaluate them on 4 different axes. Scope, the extent to which you tackled the project itself. Did you bite off all of the features, or did you only even try half of it? Correctness, to what extent is it consistent with our expectations? Design, how good is it underneath the hood? How well designed is it? So a more subjective measure. And style, a more aesthetic measure. Are your variables well named? Are things nicely indented? Is everything pretty printed, so to speak? These are the 4 axes, and they'll be weighted roughly in order in which you'll spend time on them, with style being weighted the least, but still important, correctness being worth the most, because that's arguably where you'll spend most of your time getting things to work just right. And the app party. So at the very last week of the class, Wednesday, August 7th at 6:30 p.m., we will meet standing up with laptops and with some cake and more. You're welcome to bring family and friends, and this will be an opportunity really just to share and demo for each other the individualized projects that you chose to do, or even your own implementations of mobile, local, or evil hangman, to share with the class the different design directions that you chose and see exactly what everyone accomplished. So it should be a fun way to end the term. The cameras, meanwhile, in the class. Technically, this class is not on the internet. It's an on-campus class only, but what we always do in the summer is try to experiment with new approaches to videography, try out new things, new experiments. This TV is new, and this is my first time using it. So again, forgive any gaps. We can fix them all in post-production. But what we will do on an experimental basis is post the videos that we're taking tonight and in subsequent classes online on the course's website. So if you absolutely can't make it some night, or if I was particularly confusing one night and you want to rewatch it, or fast forward, or rewind, or slow down, we'll start posting within a few days the course's videos so that you have those there as a reference as well. If you're camera shy and don't want to be on the internet and on YouTube and the like, we'll always reserve this swath of seats. So all of you folks will not appear in any of tonight's footage, even accidentally. So those first two columns of seats in the middle, if you just never want to be seen whatsoever, we'll always set aside seats there. Lastly, or second to lastly, let me introduce two of the fellows sitting over here, RJ and Rob, who will be on board as the course's teaching fellows, working with us in labs on Wednesdays, providing feedback on work, answering questions with me on Discuss. Would you each like to come up and say a word? Surprise. You have to talk. You just have to talk close to my chest. Because of the microphone.
Yeah. Hi. That's one word.
Rob.
I'm Rob.
So, all right, I'll redeem this. So Rob recently graduated from the college and is going to be working with us in an academic capacity over the coming years with courses like this one. RJ is a rising senior at the college and is also a teaching fellow for one of our undergraduate classes as well. So that was RJ and Rob. Lastly, before we take a break, one of the goals of bringing this TV online tonight was so that we could have a little of this in motion. So why don't we, first let me change state here. Pull this up, and let's take a 5 or so minute break. Whoever would like to come up and play Fruit Ninja on the TV is welcome to, and RJ, Rob, and I will field questions off to the side, and about 5 minutes from now we'll regroup. There are bathrooms down at the other end of the hallway. If you also go to the other end of the hallway and turn left and go down a smaller hallway, there's vending machines, candy and soda. We'll see you in a few. Someone better come up quick. So we are back, and we're about to teach all of JavaScript so that we can then dive into the project this coming Wednesday. So the assumptions I'd like to make here is, one, that folks are familiar with some object-oriented language. JavaScript, as we'll see, is object-oriented. It doesn't have classes per se, but you'll see a lot of the same ideas that you've seen in other languages. We'll focus, too, on just the very basics of syntax. You should find that it's incredibly similar to most any C-style language, C, C++, and so forth. And you will also find that it has most of the constructs, objects, arrays that you might expect in a higher level language like this. And we'll work our way from the simplest of examples to things more complex, ultimately ending with things like AJAX, asynchronous JavaScript and XML, which will underlie the programmatic features that we need for this coming first project. So first, a snippet again of HTML. So this is an HTML5 web page, but we can also call this a DOM, Document Object Model, which is just a fancy way for saying tree. Even though we draw the HTML like this, you can actually think of it like a family tree whose root node, so to speak, is the HTML node. So let's throw away the doc type declaration, which actually doesn't really fit into this mental model for now. But the root of this page is the HTML tag. And how many children would you say that this root of the family tree has? So it has two, one of which is head and body. So there's head and then there's body. And in turn, head and body have some number of children. So head seems to have how many children? So 1. As an aside, if you really want to be nitpicky, technically head has as many as 3 children because there's some white space here and there, and there's also some white space after the title. Most browsers throw this away, and you don't have to worry about it. But as an aside, technically you could argue there's 3 nodes. All right, but we'll assume that it's just 1. It's a title. How many children does the title element have? So it is 1. So we won't dwell on this, but there are different types of nodes in a DOM, different types of nodes in this tree, one of which is an element node. And an element is the result of having a start tag and some stuff, and a close tag, a start tag and an end tag, an open tag and a close tag. Those collectively compose what's known as an element. Meanwhile, this would be known as a text node. There's also comment nodes, which we don't have examples of here, but if you do open bracket, bang, dash, dash, that begins what would be called a comment node. But we'll focus just on these two most common ones. So meanwhile, the body tag, or the body element, to be proper, has how many children? 2. Each of which in turn seems to have 1 child. Now there's an anomaly here. There's this href, which I didn't bother giving a URL to because it's not really necessary for discussion. But this, is href a child of the anchor tag? No. So it's not. It doesn't really fit into the same hierarchical mental model that we're describing here. So we're going to draw it a little differently. Indeed, if I were to draw this picture as a tree, just using rectangles to represent the nodes, I might draw it as this. I have a document node, and this is the detail I said I was going to wave my hand at earlier. Turns out that there is an uber node, the document node. And for those familiar with JavaScript, you might have seen this before, the document global variable. We'll come back to that. But here's our root element, HTML. Indeed, it has 2 children, head and body, each of which has a title tag over here and a child of that. This guy has an anchor tag and an h1 tag, each of which has a textual child. And then just because it definitely doesn't belong below the node, implying that it's child, I'll arbitrarily draw the attribute laterally off to the side. So it's an attribute of the node, but it's not a child per se. So who cares about this detail? Well, if you start thinking about the HTML you see and the HTML you write as ultimately constituting a tree, once that HTML is parsed, that is read top to bottom, left to right by a browser, loaded into memory as an actual data structure, namely a tree, this is what it might look like inside of your computer's RAM. And this is a useful way of thinking about it, because now that as we begin to dive into JavaScript, JavaScript is increasingly being used to take a tree like this and massage it into a different tree, adding nodes, subtracting nodes. Already, if you're a Facebook user or a Gmail user, things happen quite dynamically these days. If you get an email with Gmail, the whole page does not reload certainly these days. Instead, you just get a new row in the middle of the web page. That row is probably a tr or something like that inside of a table tag, maybe, or maybe it's a div, but something like that. How is Gmail updating the inside of its web page? It's using JavaScript to insert more rectangles like these somewhere into the middle of the page. Facebook, when you get a Facebook chat or a status notification or a tweet that pushes everything else down, what's happening? This language called JavaScript is inserting a new node or rectangle into the tree and pushing everything else down or to the side, depending on how the programmer decided to do it. So that's what's been happening all this time underneath the hood, and we'll see how to do that ourselves momentarily. So JavaScript. How do you go about writing JavaScript? Well, historically, it runs client-side inside of a browser. So if you've got a website written in PHP or Python or Ruby, you might have JavaScript in that site, but it's not getting executed by your server. It's being sent to the server via HTTP over the internet, and then the browser is reading that JavaScript code just like it reads the HTML, top to bottom, left to right, and executing it on your own Mac or PC. So where do you put the JavaScript? Well, we've seen already you can have script tags. We haven't seen them with stuff in between, but the simplest way to start writing JavaScript, as we'll see, is to just put it inside of an open script and a closed script tag, just like that. But of course, you're probably more familiar already with this format. Just to recap, what does this line of HTML do? What does it tell a browser to do? Exactly. Load file.js and treat it as a file containing JavaScript code. So if there's code in it, it should be executed, top to bottom, left to right. So we'll see how to actually embed that in a web page. What about the language itself? Here I'm going to take a shortcut and just wave my hand at all of the syntactic features of JavaScript. Why? Most of these keywords, if not all of them, are probably familiar to you no matter what language you've actually used before. A couple might be new, might not have used the for-in construct before, might not have used try-catch if you're not familiar with exceptions, might not have seen var before, but it's just what we use to declare a variable. But you can probably guess what most of these do. So break is usually used inside of a loop or a switch to break out of it. And we'll go through this quickly. These are the details we'll come back to over time as needed. And any number of online references can reinforce. Const specifies that it should be a constant value. Continue means to do another iteration of a loop without necessarily proceeding further down below the line of code. Do while means do something again and again, but check the condition at the bottom instead of at the top. For starts a loop. For in is useful when you want to iterate over an array. It's just a shorthand way of typing out a traditional for loop, as we'll eventually see. Function says here comes a function. You have to explicitly say here comes a function with that keyword. If else, got to be familiar. Return, got to be familiar. Switch is just a different way of writing an if, else statement. Throw relates to exceptions. You'll see these a little bit in JavaScript, but we won't spend much time on them. They're also present in iOS, but not super commonly used, at least in the APIs we'll mostly spend our time in. But it's a way of handling errors. Instead of returning -1 or returning false or null or some sentinel value like that, throw and try and catch are mechanisms in languages like JavaScript that allow your code to just throw up an error, and typically they'll kill the program unless you have written code defensively to catch a potential such thrown exception. And we'll see if these come up today or in the future. Var lets you declare a variable, and while just starts a loop. And there's a few other things, but the rapidity with which we just went through that is just to suggest that JavaScript, even if new to you, is probably pretty familiar based on most any other language you've used. How do you declare an array? So an array, what's really nice about JavaScript is that it makes nice use of syntactic sugar, which means using shorthand notation to do common things. Open square bracket, close square bracket gives you an empty array. You can also write out the word array, capital A-R-R-A-Y, open paren, close paren, calling effectively a constructor for the array class. But it's not really called a constructor, and it's not really called a class. So the more common way of seeing it anyway is just to have open bracket, square bracket. So we'll see that in some examples eventually. And to get an empty object, we use curly braces. And we're back. So let's go about actually implementing some simple JavaScript examples, working our way up to more compelling examples, particularly ones that leverage some mobile-specific features. For instance, we'll leverage a feature of HTML5 that's particularly useful in a mobile context if you want to store data persistently, even offline potentially without internet access, called local storage. We'll also take a look at the geolocation API, which allows you in JavaScript code to ask the browser and in turn the iOS phone or iPad or iPod, where am I in the world, and actually get back some GPS coordinates and also a measurement of just how accurate that estimation is. So let me go back to the sample code for tonight. I'm inside of the JS directory. And let me go into the dom0.html file. So again, if you go to CS76.net, if you haven't already, you can download all of this code to play along at home. And if you pull up this page, you get a super simple example. It apparently is a form with a text field and with a form field. And let me go ahead and view the page's source so we can see what's going on underneath the hood here. And let's first focus on what's familiar. Let me scroll to the bottom, and we see a body tag. We see inside of that body a form tag, an ID. What's an ID attribute used for if you've not used it before? Or if you have used it before? Exactly. So if you've not used it before, the ID attribute, which can be applied to most any HTML tag, allows you to uniquely identify it in the DOM. It's totally the honor system. It's up to you, the developer, to make sure that you don't give any other element the same ID, but it allows you to have quick access to a particular element, not only in CSS and in your style sheets, but also, as we'll see, in JavaScript code. So you don't have to go searching through the whole tree trying to find a node of interest. So we'll come back to onSubmit. Let's dive into input. So I have apparently given an ID of name to an input tag that has a placeholder. So this is interesting. It turns out that in HTML5, there's actually a few useful attributes that you might not have seen before. So let's actually suspend this thread for just a moment. Let me go back into our earlier directory just to make sure folks have seen this. And if I go into inputs.html, notice this too is a form without even a submit button, because my goal isn't to submit this form, but just to demonstrate different types of form fields. Now they're going to wrap a little bit because the lines are long, but notice in this form I have 3 input tags, and I've got an auto capitalize equals quote unquote off attribute. You can probably guess what that does. Tells the phone, in most cases, don't try auto capitalizing this, which can be annoying. Autocomplete equals quote unquote off. That just disables the little drop down that will often appear if you previously typed something into the field. It's pretty common on desktop browsers. Autocorrect equals off. Increasingly helpful on mobile devices and also supported on more and more desktop browsers. Just means don't correct my spelling. Placeholder equals quote unquote. That puts what in the text box? Yeah, placeholder text, like grayed out text that's there until you click on it or start typing. So it's just useful for instructions. And then finally, type. This is interesting too. This first one has type equals text, which is old school. But notice in HTML5, you can have type equals email and type equals URL. Now, that does not mean that the browser is going to validate the field for you. You can type in any word you want into an email field, and you won't get yelled at just because it doesn't look like an email address. Similar for the URL. You can type in any word you want, even if it's not a URL. The browser's not going to yell at you. So why in the world would the browser care what type of field this should be?
Does Safari add the @ symbol to email?
What do you mean add the @ symbol?
Like in the keyboard?
Ah, so the keyboard, but not my physical keyboard.
No, but if you're on an iPhone.
Yeah, so indeed, let's go back to Safari in the simulator here. Let's go back to the directory listing and go to inputs. And now notice what happens. If I click on the first of these inputs, the very top one was just type equals text, notice that I get this keyboard. Okay, pretty uninteresting. Done. Now if I click on the email field, let's see how good your recall is. What changed? So you get a smaller space bar and the @ sign there. So it's just for the user's convenience. And what are we probably going to see if we instead dismiss this and click the URL field? Exactly. It changes ever so slightly, and I also get the slash for easy access. So it's just a little bit of icing on the cake for the user to make it easier to interact with your site. All right, so now let's go back to the example we were at before, which was not this one here, but with just the DOM0 file in the JS directory that looked like this. So notice at the bottom, I've added a couple of other things to the input tag. Placeholder equals quote unquote name, just to be explanatory. Type equals text, so no special keyboards. Finally, an input of type equals submit. But there's something else here that you might not have used before, but you can probably guess what it does. This attribute called onSubmit presumably tells the browser to call a function called greet when the form is submitted. How do you submit a form? Well, you either click the physical submit button, or if you're on a desktop computer, you hit the enter key. That will often do it as well. So in either case, the act of submitting a form happens. But with this onSubmit attribute, you're telling the browser, listen for that event, so to speak. And JavaScript and web programming more generally is very much event-driven. When that form is submitted, an event happens, and onSubmit is an event handler, a listener that's waiting to hear that event of submission. And what should it do? Well, we don't know much JavaScript yet, most likely, but it looks like code. And indeed, I should call a greet function with no arguments, and then I should return false. And we'll come to back to greet in a second. Return false. What would that possibly mean, to return false inside of an attribute, inside of a form tag?
Probably to prevent submission.
Exactly. So what might you want to stop when a form is submitted? Well, the form being submitted itself to the server. If the whole point right now is to start writing code that runs on the client side, inside of the browser, we don't even need a server once we've downloaded the HTML and the CSS and the JavaScript, right? We can lose internet connectivity altogether, potentially, if all of the code is running locally on my phone or iPad or iPod right now. So onSubmit just says, call the greet function, but no matter what happens, do not actually submit this form. So it's your chance to intervene. So now let's scroll up to the top of the file. Most of it's pretty boring HTML, title tag, head tag, and all of that. But notice toward the top of the file, I've introduced that script tag. And then I've put right there in the script tag, function greet. So we promise that the function keyword means here comes a function. Then open paren, close paren means it takes no arguments. Open curly brace, close curly brace defines the scope of the function. And it's a one-line function. Turns out in JavaScript, there's a function that's super useful, but not to be used in production code, that just opens a pop-up. If you remember 8, 10 years ago, when pop-ups were very much in vogue and alerts were very much in vogue, that's how you invoke them. That's one way of opening prompts on a user screen. So what is this going to do? Well, let's take a quick glance at some syntax, but you can probably guess what this is doing based on other languages. It's wrapping a bit because the line is long, but this is calling alert, passing in a single argument of type string. So JavaScript does have the notion of data types, as we'll see. Quote, unquote, with a comma, hello. And what do you think the plus is doing? Concatenation. So you've seen this in Java. If you're a PHP programmer, you've seen dot. Other languages use different symbols. Now, document.getElementById of name. Now, I had no idea until a second ago that function existed, but it seems that a function called getElementById exists. It's associated with some kind of global variable called document. So more properly, it's a method inside of an object called document. What is that object called document? Well, if we go back to the screen from earlier, recall that, the document node. If you've programmed JavaScript already and you ever use document dot something, you've essentially been talking to that guy who has some special functionality built in. And clearly he's important because he can see the entirety of the tree from his vantage point. So if we now go back to my own code, document.getElementById does exactly what you think it does. Give me the element from the tree. Give me the rectangle whose ID is quote unquote name, which is what type of element, just to be clear? Not a string per se. What type of HTML element was it? An input. So give me the rectangle that represents the input whose ID is name in that tree structure. Why? Because I then want to dive in deeper and get its value. So here's the object-oriented nature of JavaScript. The dot means go inside of this object, go inside of this object, and get some member function or member variable, data field. So document's an object. It has a method called getElementById. That method returns, apparently, an object, a rectangle, that represents that node from the tree. And one of its properties, something inside of that rectangle, is apparently a property, a data field, data value, whatever you want to call it, an instance variable called value. That gives you the value that the user typed into that field. So what is the net effect, in layman's terms, of this line of code? To trigger an alert with what text? Hello, so-and-so, whatever your name actually is. So let's give this a try. Let's go back to the web page itself. Let me go ahead and type in Rob and click Submit. And there it is, hello, Rob. It's definitely a poor man's user interface in that we're just triggering this browser-dependent screen. Chrome even gives its own logo here. So there's other ways of doing this, but clearly we've dynamically gotten some data from that DOM element. But hopefully we can do a bit better. So let me actually roll back, not to 0, but to dom1.html. The form is going to be the same, but let's instead introduce a slightly different approach here. So in this version, what appears to be different at first glance, even if you can't read all of the lines in question? I moved the script. I moved the script down below. All right, why did I do that? Or what's the effect of this? There's a few things different here. Well, let's take a look. So one, it's an important detail that the form is now coming before the script. Because one of the conclusions we reached earlier is that JavaScript's reading of a page, or browser's parsing of a page, is synchronous. It does things one at a time, at a time, at a time. So in fact, as a tangent, if you've ever used Google Analytics or you use like the Facebook like button, actually Google Analytics specifically tells you to put their code where? Sorry? At the end, right above the close body tag. Why? Well, just in case Google servers are slow or the user has a slow connection to Google but not to you, Google doesn't want to be responsible for slowing down the loading of your web page lest the user see nothing until Google also loads its JavaScript cookie tracking code at the bottom. Now, the last time I looked, Facebook tells you to put their code where? Okay, right after the open body tag, thereby giving it more priority. But in their defense, the way Google loads code into your page is they actually retroactively go back and inject it into the top of the page, so it's not actually a blocking call. So different subtleties that we'll not spend time on here, but that's the motivation for those different design decisions is how will the page's loading be affected. So let's see what the relevance here is. Here's my form. I've this time given it an ID of demo so that I can uniquely identify the form element itself. I have the same input and submit button as before. And then down here I have a script. But notice my code has changed a little bit. What's the first syntactic difference that you see this time that wasn't here before? Yeah?
Oh, well, return false is not after the ultimate like it was in the original one. It's below.
OK, good. So notice that return false is below the HTML itself. It's not inside of the HTML. In fact, there's no onSubmit attribute anymore. Instead, we seem to be manipulating a property called onSubmit. So again, to the object-oriented nature of JavaScript, it turns out that just as there's this global document object, inside of which is a method called getElementById. That, in turn, is going to return the element whose ID is demo. And which element is that? What type of element? It's a form. It turns out that form elements have a property called onSubmit. And this is not a property whose value is supposed to be a number or a string. It's supposed to be a function pointer, so to speak, a reference to a function, the address of a function. Think of it however you'd like based on what language you have as a background. So onSubmit equals, what does this mean? Notice that on the right-hand side here, there's the keyword function again, open paren, close paren. But what is absent this time from the function declaration? There's no name of this function. But it doesn't matter, right? Because what I'm actually doing here is clearly creating what seems to be an anonymous function. It's a function with no name, otherwise known as a lambda function. And when you call the function keyword in this way, notice I have the open curly brace, then some stuff, then close curly brace, semicolon. So I've declared in these few lines of code an anonymous function, but because I have an equal sign right before it, I'm essentially storing the address of that function, a pointer there too, or a reference to that function where? As the value of this onSubmit property. The browser has been defined, meanwhile, to know if this onSubmit property, previously null, is set to a valid reference of a function when the form is actually submitted by the user by clicking submit or hitting enter on a physical keyboard. Find this value, call that function, and return true or false based on what it tells you to do. So clearly it's returning false. What else is it doing? It's also doing the alert, but the alert thing is the same as before. So what have we done? We've removed the onSubmit attribute from the HTML, replaced it instead with pure JavaScript code. Why? What's an argument in favor of this approach? Yeah?
Well, for some reason, if the browser doesn't like JavaScript, or if the JavaScript breaks, the form itself is not going to crash your browser.
OK, good. So just in case we're using a browser that has some incompatibilities, by moving the code outside of the context of the form, the script is more likely to be ignored. And indeed, that should be the case. Even browsers that have JavaScript off should just ignore the contents of this tag. So it's not a bad thought. In reality, I don't think it would end up being a problem, because if the browser just doesn't support JavaScript, the fact that we had onSubmit equals quote unquote something should also be ignored in the same way. But not a bad approach. Yeah?
Similar to MVC approach, we abstract a model from the view.
Good. So we'll come back to the jargon of MVC probably in a week or two. But for now, let's summarize it as my code was getting a little sloppy. Not only did I have HTML and then also some CSS in that file up above in previous examples, now I'm putting actual logic, programming code inside of my markup language, whose name suggests it should be for markup, making things bold, making things centered, structuring a page. Should have nothing to do fundamentally with code. So in the interests of keeping my coding life separate from my markup life, this is generally a better approach. It's not perfect, because frankly, it's like half a foot away from where it was before. So we haven't really solved this problem. But keeping code separate from logic and presentation is a key theme that we'll come back to, because it permeates the iOS SDK and the environment for writing iPhone apps. But this is at least a step toward that. And also, if we're only calling this function onSubmit, we definitely don't need to give it a name. If I'm the only person ever calling this code, I called it greet before, but I didn't even really need that name, because clearly I can do without it entirely.
What's the difference between single quote and double quote?
Good question. In JavaScript, none. I'm in the habit lately of using all single quotes for JavaScript and all double quotes for HTML, but there's functionally no difference in JavaScript. He's referring to the single quotes I had around demo, for instance. This would be a matter of style, too. For the projects, if you have a religion about single and double quoting, that's fine. Just be self-consistent with respect to your own code. All right, so now let me go into this file. And let's see, I'll use the simplest of programs on Mac OS, TextEdit. And I'm going to go into, remember, John Harvard's sites folder, which is where we put this code. I'm going to go into source 0, go into JavaScript, and go into dom1.html. So here's that web page, but now it's in an editable program. I'm going to scroll down, and I'm going to do things the opposite. I'm going to delete the script tag, and I'm going to put it above the form. And then I'm going to save the file. I'm going to go back to my browser. I'm going to reload the page. So indeed, the browser now sees the change I made in TextEdit. I'm going to go back to the page itself and reload this. So the form has been reloaded on the page. And now I'm going to go ahead and type in Rob again and submit. And it seems to have broken. In fact, I see a question mark in the URL, which usually means a form has physically been submitted to a server, which I did not intend. There was supposed to be a return false. So let me start diagnosing things. So when doing the first project in the course, much as Apple likes Safari, using Chrome is probably the better browser to use from a development perspective because it has additional features, one of which is this inspector element at the bottom, which Safari has its own variant of. But I think you'll find that Chrome is useful both for mobile and desktop development. And I'm going to go into the console window here for a moment. And that's interesting. The red text, which if I zoom in, says uncaught type error, cannot set property on submit of null. So that's kind of a mouthful. I didn't really understand the first half. But on submit looks familiar, and null sounds worrisome. So let's see where in my code I use the keyword on submit. So here's my code. On submit, can't call this with respect to null. So again, the error was cannot set property on submit of null. So what does this suggest is null? The no demo. Specifically, the return value of the method getElementById when passed an argument of quote-unquote demo is apparently now returning not a rectangle, but null. And null is the null object. It has no properties, certainly not one called onSubmit, which is why Chrome is freaking out and not doing anything. And in fact, Chrome and most browsers' approach when there's a JavaScript error is just to forge ahead blindly. In this case, it submitted the form, irrespective of my return false. Why is all of a sudden the demo element null? Yeah. Exactly. It's because the browser is parsing this code top to bottom, left to right. And at this point in the story, when I'm reading the script tag in its new location, I can call getElementById of quote-unquote demo all I want. It won't exist until we get down there. But I'm calling this line of code here, which is why sort of coincidentally, my code worked fine before, even though I put my script tag still in the file, but below. But this too, in the spirit of keeping my code separate from my HTML, feels a little hackish to just solve all of my JavaScript problems by putting my code at the very bottom of my files. Hopefully there's a better way than that. And there is, if we scroll back to our demos here, and let me go into the last version of DOM, DOM2, which hopefully works. Hello, Rob, in fact works. Let's take a look at this code here and see what's different. All right, my HTML seems to have been vastly simplified, and I'm now practicing what I've been preaching about not commingling code with my raw markup. In fairness, I've just moved it up to the top, but at least now it's inside of the head element, which at least is sort of conceptually distinct from the body, which is where the actual aesthetics of my page should be. And frankly, at this point, we could rip out this code and put it where? In a separate file called like file.js, like I suggested earlier. So we're almost there, but we'll just leave it with this example. But now I see some scary looking syntax and also one new script tag. What are we apparently loading into memory here? Yeah, jQuery. So jQuery is a super, super popular library for JavaScript. So popular that many people confuse JavaScript with jQuery itself, and they say, I know jQuery, when really they know JavaScript and they also know jQuery, but they're not alternatives to one another. What jQuery does is it allows you to dramatically simplify the amount and the complexity of code that you need to write, because some very smart people, one in particular, has spent a number of years now building up a corpus of code that just makes everyone's life easier. And it's all open source. You can read through it. It's thousands of lines long. But for our purposes, let's just focus on some of the highlights and some of the features that we'll see commonly throughout any library you might use for this first project or really desktop development in general. So turns out there's a $, which is a popular aspect of jQuery. What does the $, represent in jQuery? What special significance does the $, have in JavaScript? It's a selector. So it is, but let's focus not so much on its functionality, but just syntactically. What is it? Syntactic sugar? It kind of is, but it's not even, I'm not even sure I'd call it that. It is just a valid symbol for a variable. So whereas in some languages $ has special meaning, like in PHP, it demarks an actual variable's beginning, or in some languages you just can't use it. You can't have a $ in a variable's name. JavaScript doesn't care. You can absolutely have a $ as the name of your variable. Now, jQuery, the folks who wrote it, just realized, oh, this would be kind of sexy if we just started using $ to represent our class called jQuery. But what this really is if I go into my code, and this is again dom2.html. For those who've been using jQuery for some time and just taking it for granted, this is equivalent to that. There is we'll call it a class, even though it's not quite a class, called jQuery. And it takes an argument, and that argument can be a CSS selector. In this case, it's the actual name of a global variable document, but that's all it is. So it's not quite syntactic sugar in that it has no fundamental special significance. We humans just view it as something special. All right, so more properly, jQuery is a function, and there's a hell of a lot of functionality built into that one particular function. And among the things it does, and let's go back to the common case of having $, is it wraps traditional DOM nodes. So all of those rectangles we've been talking about, jQuery wraps them in the sense of making them a little wider and a little taller and adding more properties and more methods to them. On the end of the day, inside of it is still the original rectangle, but they've simplified the means by which you can talk to that rectangle from the tree. So $, open paren, close paren, document takes that document node from the top of the tree and just gives it more functionality, more power, if you will. .ready is a shorthand way of saying no matter how big this web page is, no matter how many lines of HTML there are, only call the following function when the entire page has been loaded top to bottom, left to right. So what this means is that this line of code can now be anywhere in our page, in the head, in the body, in another file. It doesn't matter whatsoever. That means wait until the entirety of the page is literally ready. So what am I passing to the ready method? So the ready method expects an argument whose data type is apparently a function pointer, so to speak. It expects a function as its argument. And now what am I doing? It's an anonymous function because I don't care what the thing is called. It just needs to exist and be callable. Open curly brace, and it's a little messy, but here is the other curly brace, close parenthesis. So it's starting to get a little hard to read, but notice open paren, close paren. So those are balanced. Open paren, open curly, close paren. So everything else is inside of this anonymous function. What is inside of this anonymous function? Turns out I'm doing the same kind of trick in the next line. $, quote unquote, sharp demo. So those of you familiar very well with CSS, this represents what? It's a CSS selector for the node whose ID is demo. So the hash sign means give me the node whose ID is demo. If you instead had .demo, that means give me the node that has a class of demo, and there's some other selectors as well. But this one means give me the one node whose ID is demo. .submit, they've simplified the wording, and jQuery does more than this, but rather than call it onSubmit, it's just called submit. And what does the submit function expect as its argument? It expects its own function, an anonymous function that it's going to kind of tuck away and call only when what happens? That element's submit handler is needed. So this is just a third and final way of associating an action, an event handler, a function, with an event, like form submission. So what happens next? Finally, it's boring again. Alert, hello, so-and-so. And in fact, I'm cheating here, or I'm mixing my syntax. What should this line 11 really be if I go into that code? Let me open up Notepad again, open up DOM2, and based on that lesson learned, what can I actually change this to? $, and hash name. So that's what I mean in part by jQuery simplifying otherwise fairly verbose code. Document.get element by ID can literally be summarized as $, because the jQuery function $, knows that when it's passed an argument that's not a global variable like document, which just gets immediately wrapped with a bigger rectangle, when it realizes, oh, this is a string, but this string starts with a hash sign, it knows that that means the rest of the word is the ID for a node in my DOM. So here again is just how jQuery simplifies our life, even though at first glance it absolutely looks more cryptic, but really it's ultimately saving us time. And again, we could factor out that code further into a JS file so that it doesn't even appear anywhere in our raw HTML. Whew.
Is that required for if you have unique ID? If two IDs have the same value?
Good question. Is it required to have a unique ID? It is a error of syntax for you to give two elements in a web page the same ID.
So if I give them the same ID, what do I?
Well, you might get back, I don't know offhand, you might get back an array of 2 or more nodes, but I think it's fair to say, and I think the spec probably says the behavior is undefined, certainly for a JavaScript library, but I don't know offhand. Other questions? Yeah. No longer. It's not quite that. It's just, this is literally the honor system. Like, for the web to work, all of us have to agree on some rules, and one of those rules is do not screw up and give two elements in a web page the same ID. And if you do, we're not sure what's going to happen. At least I'm not sure. There might be some formal definition. I'll look it up later tonight. That's fine. If you have two elements with the same class, you'll get back an array, and the following function will be applied to that array, effectively. Even though it's not quite an array, it's in a wrapper that jQuery returns. OK. All right, so not bad. But thus far, all we're doing is manipulating DOM elements. It would be nice to start introducing some functionality. So why don't we go ahead and introduce a bit of storage capabilities? So where we left off, we had this thing here. And let's jump ahead to, I'm getting much better at this, local storage. So where can you store information in a browser when programming in JavaScript? Some of you might know from past experience, or now that you know JavaScript runs client-side, you have very few options to begin with. In window. So there's this global object called window that in theory you can store data in. But if that window closes, for instance, the browser quits, what happens to any variables you've tucked away there? They disappear. And this is what a lot of popular libraries do. They'll tuck important stuff in the window object. It's effectively making something a global variable, but it's not persistent. So where else can you put it? Obviously, the answer is going to be local storage. But leading up to local storage, where else can you put it? Cookies. So you can actually write JavaScript code to plant cookies on the user's computer that didn't come from the server. They came from your local JavaScript code. But what's the downside of using cookies? Correct. There's a size limit, which is generally pretty small, and they also can sometimes be disabled by users. They might not persist as long as intended if you're in incognito mode and the like. So there's a number of reasons where cookies get tripped off. And we're not going to solve all of those problems, but those are a couple of barriers. What else? If you have a server, you could just put it in a database, certainly. But maybe that's not ideal, especially if you're trying to make a mobile app that is fast by using local data as much as possible. So it turns out that local storage is a relatively new feature, popular in HTML5, that gives you access to another global variable, really inside the window, that is called local storage, capital S. And it has a few methods associated with it, among which are clear, which means just clear out anything I've put there already. Get item, which means give me the value of an item with a certain key. So get item takes one argument, a string, which is the identifier of whatever you put there. So for those familiar, local storage is a hash table, or it's a dictionary, or it's any number, an associative array. It can be thought of as any number of these things. Remove item does the opposite of set item, because set item takes two arguments, a key and a value, and it stores it locally in the browser. The upside of which is if you close the window, quit the browser, and don't clear the history in the computer, in the browser entirely, it's still going to be there later. So why might this be useful? Storing things like your address book for auto-completion, storing things like your inbox potentially if it's a mail application, storing a non-trivial amount of data for easy, ready access. So let's take a quick look at an example involving storage. So if we go back to today's sample code in storage.html, I have apparently visited this page 0 times. All right, if I dismiss this alert, reload this page, I have now visited this page 1 time before. All right, can guess where this is going. Reload the page 2 times before, but we just cited any number of ways where we could be storing the number 2, and then the number 3, and the number 4. It could be in a var, a variable, in the web page itself. So this isn't all that interesting. But let me go ahead and copy the URL so I don't have to remember what it was. Open a new browser window, save, 3, It actually remembered this time. Let's play with fire. Quit the browser, reload it, visit it again. 4 times. So something is persisting. And it turns out it's relatively easy to actually implement this. If we look at the source of this page, I really kind of cut some corners on the aesthetics of the page. There's nothing actually there other than code. If we go in here and scroll down to the bottom of the page, notice that the HTML is super simple. We've got a title, a head, and a body, and then another HTML attribute. Not the only way to do this, and again, this is kind of a regression to the messier way, but it keeps the code super simple and the focus on the new stuff for now. What happens when the body is loaded, apparently? Call the greet function. So onload is like onSubmit, but it's when the body of the page is loaded. So now if we look up here, we have a bunch of lines of JavaScript code. It's a little more complex, but notice there's not much more in the head, just that familiar meta tag. And now the function called greet, what does it do? So a little new syntax here. So there's a few ways to do this, but a really rigorous way to check whether or not a variable exists in JavaScript is to take the symbol's name, in this case local storage, capital S, pass it to the typeOf operator, and typeOf is literally going to return a string whose value is number, or string, or bool, or undefined, if that variable has not yet been defined or set. So I'm literally checking for that. If the type of local storage is quote unquote undefined, then what is the implication? Or rather, is not undefined. Not undefined. But it looks like I made a typo here. Not equals equals. Feels like there's one too many equals for most languages. But it turns out that JavaScript, like some languages, does actually support different numbers of equal signs in certain contexts. Let me open the same file with TextEdit just so I can tweak some things. Zoom in here. You probably would have expected me to type this. And that it would actually work correctly too in all cases. But it's not quite as rigorous as doing this. Does anyone know what it means when you do not equals equals? Or, if easier to answer the other way, what this would mean, equals equals equals. Same instance, not quite same instance, but same value and same type. So JavaScript, as I mentioned earlier, does have disparate types, even though you, the programmer, don't specify them when declaring variables. So you don't say string, you don't say int, you don't say float. You just have access to those disparate data types. When I check the type of local storage and I say not equals equals, this is making sure that not only is the return value of typeOf not equal to quote unquote string, it is also at least a string itself. This is, in retrospect, a bad example because there's no instance in which this could go awry. A better example, and I'll think of one in the future, is that if I were checking the return value of some function and it could return null, for instance, but maybe it could return 0, those two values are often conflated. If you want to check a function's return value that could return null or could return 0, you can't rely on equals equals because they will implicitly cast to one another. Null is the same as 0. But if you want to check that the return value of some function is really, really null, or really, really 0, not just some implicit equivalent, then you use equals equals equals. Or if you want to check the opposite, you use bang equals equals. So I apologize. This wasn't a good way to introduce that story. We'll fix it in the video.
So you're combining like multiple attributes?
Combining multiple characteristics, let's say, sure, of the values you're checking, both of the storage container you're checking, both its value and its type. Long story short, getting into this habit is not a bad thing because it means your code will never be vulnerable to those random corner cases where maybe two values could cast to the same thing. The number 1 could cast to true, the number 2 could cast to true, but true is true if you use the identity operator in this way. OK, let's not get too hung up on that and instead move on to this. Same trick as before, but let's just take for granted now that if typeOf local storage, open bracket, close quote, quote unquote, counter is undefined, what's the implication? So let's try to rewind this. This just says if the type of local storage is not undefined, that is equivalent logically to saying is local storage defined? Because if it is, I'm using a modern browser, supports HTML5, and therefore clearly supports local storage. This one line of code is only checking, does your browser support local storage? Second line is checking not whether local storage is supported, but specifically whether what is the case. Is there a variable called counter inside of local storage? So local storage is, again, a hash table, a dictionary, an associative array, a key value storage mechanism, however you want to think of it. This is just saying if we have never before defined a value for quote-unquote counter, what do I want to initialize its value to, apparently? I want to just give it a value of 0. So this just means if this is the first time the person's ever visited the site, obviously local storage isn't even going to know that I care about a variable called counter, so let's make that exist and assign it the value of 0. Then let's trigger that alert. You have visited this many times, and then what do? Increment it again. So this just ensures that that one-time corner case is covered. Else down here, your browser does not support local storage is what happens if it is, in fact, undefined. So where am I actually storing the value? Well, I'm not actually using set item or get item. It actually suffices just to use this array notation. So this is because local storage itself is an object, and we can treat it as though it's an array with this square bracket notation, syntactic sugar, if you will. But in this case here, we're setting the value, and in this case here, we're setting the value as well by just doing a traditional plus plus. All right. So why might that be useful? Storing user preferences, potentially, or other things where you might want to remember some details about the user without having to query the server again and again for the same answer. All right. If you switch the browser, in what sense?
Like you open a Safari to open the same HTTP.
Oh, good question. That won't work. This is browser specific. So if I visit the page in Chrome, I get local storage within Chrome. If I then open Safari, Safari and has its own local storage container for me. It does not propagate across browsers. Yeah?
Are there limits to how much data you can store locally?
There is. I don't remember the value offhand. It's much bigger than a cookie, but not infinite, if that helps. That will be my other mental note to check, and as RJ is probably reminding me now. Yeah?
Use it easily remove this local storage, delete just like cookies, like cache?
Yes. So I believe one of the various settings in Chrome, let's see, clear browsing data, one of these should apply to, it's probably the one that's simplified as empty the cache. That probably includes local storage. Good question. And then you can programmatically clear it by calling the clear method. All right. So let's introduce one particularly cool feature that we can leverage in a mobile context by introducing this guy. So it turns out, and this is sort of retro if you were around when the internet was popular with Netscape, Navigator, the Navigator global object, similar in spirit to Window and Document, has special properties or methods associated with it. And Navigator in this case, Navigator refers to the browser itself as opposed to the window or the document that you're actually viewing. .geolocation is an API, an application programming interface, a set of functions, maybe properties that you, the programmer, can use to talk to the browser. Inside of this API is at least one method of interest today, getCurrentPosition. Now this is a method that we can call just like getItem or setItem, but it works a little differently in that it doesn't just give me back the value right away. Finding the user's location is what's called an asynchronous problem to solve. Right? Because it might take a few seconds to turn on the Wi-Fi antennas or the GPS radio and figure out where the user is. And one of the key design features of JavaScript is that as much as possible, things should be asynchronous, so that when something's happening over here, it doesn't block something else from happening here. You don't want the whole browser to lock up while you're trying to figure out the user's location. It would be nice if they could keep doing other things. So the means by which you can implement that design goal is by way of what are called callback functions. And we've seen these already, but now we can use them even more deliberately with this geolocation example. So let me go back to my directory listing and go into geolocation0.html. And I actually don't see anything yet, but what do I see apparently in my browser? Localhost wants to use your computer's location. So my computer's location, physically, GPS, latitude and longitude, thankfully, Chrome is giving me a little bit of defense here and not just telling a random website, even though it happens to be running on localhost, where I am in the world. I mean, this could get down to a pretty precise location, and you don't want just to give that information out to anyone that asks for it. So if I go over here, I can deny or allow this. Well, let's allow this. And now let's see what happens. Apparently, this page's purpose in life is just to tell me my GPS coordinates with some degree of confidence. So we're at 42.3, comma, negative 71.1. So if we look that up on Google Maps, we'll probably end up in roughly that location. Let's actually see if we can search Google by GPS coordinates. Let's go to the actual maps.google.com. Search here. And indeed, we are, let's turn on satellite view. My laptop is underneath the grass there. And that's actually, it is true. We are in the basement. So it's pretty darn accurate. So how in the world does my laptop, which does not have a GPS radio, I'm not using my phone or anything in this context, how does Google know where my laptop is? So Wi-Fi, how do you mean? Okay, so these are Wi-Fi antennas. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them in this room alone, at least. And those Wi-Fi radios all have unique identifiers of some sort. They have the SSID to which we connect, like Harvard University, and they have other metadata associated with them. For years, there was a technique known as war driving, which was like literally people in cars driving around trying to find open access, Wi-Fi access points for various reasons. And companies, among them Google, do this too, to figure out, just by driving around, for instance, where do you hear Harvard University? And they carry around a GPS radio with that computer program to say, I heard Harvard University at these GPS coordinates. But the world has gotten even more sophisticated than 10 years ago. Nowadays, we don't need cars driving around campus. Who is doing all of this snooping for us? Like all of us idiots, right? Every one of us that has one of these cell phones in our pockets that has a GPS radio and also has Wi-Fi or 3G or LTE access can be phoning home to Apple in this case, or if you have an Android phone, to Google in that case, if you have a Windows phone, to Microsoft in that case, telling the world when you're on the Harvard University network what your GPS coordinates are, when you're on the Starbucks network what its GPS coordinates are. So all of us are effectively phoning home and training these big companies to know with some degree of probability where we are. And clearly it works pretty well, but that's because we've all been helping them for some time. So putting aside the fear factor, let's just focus on the positive, which is what we can now do with this functionality. So apparently any random guy on the internet making a web page who knows some JavaScript and has a web server can write JavaScript code that asks the user for his or her location and then does something with it. In this case, totally underwhelming in that we just prompted the user with their GPS coordinates. But what could you use the location for to be more a sexier application? You could show the user's location on a map, right? I kind of implemented that myself manually by going to Google Maps and pasting it in. We could do that programmatically by using the Google Maps API. The website could tell me where the nearest Starbucks is based on my location. It could tell me what the news is for Cambridge, Massachusetts, or the weather for Cambridge, Massachusetts, because it knows where my coordinates are. So there's a number of things that can just lower the bar to giving me things that I might be interested in. So it's a pretty compelling user feature, albeit at utter cost of privacy. So how do we go about leveraging this? Let's look at the source code. This is geolocation0.html. Notice again, the body of the page is super simple with an onload attribute whose value is geolocate, arbitrary named function that I wrote. Could have called it whatever we want. Open paren, close paren means call it. And now if we look at the head of my page where the script is, again, I could be putting this code in a separate file, but I've kept it in the HTML file so all the demos are self-contained. Notice that we have two functions. One is literally called callback, and it takes an argument called position. Let's come back to that in a moment. One is called geolocate, no arguments. What does it do? It first checks if the type of navigator.geolocation is not undefined. So what does it mean if geolocation is not undefined? The browser supports it, which means we can proceed to use it without throwing one of those red error messages where like symbol not found or something like that. So navigator.geolocation.getCurrentPosition, and then I'm passing in what? Callback. But notice, there's a close paren around callback, but what is there not? There's not a pair of parentheses right next to callback itself. So am I calling callback here? So no, I'm just passing its address effectively. I'm passing a reference to that function to the function called getCurrentPosition so that he can call callback when he's ready. Now, why might it take some time? Well, we just saw an example. If the browser prompts me, the human, to decide yes or no, share my location, that could be a minute later, a second later, an hour later. You don't necessarily want the whole web page to lock up while you're waiting for the user's input. So instead, you do this asynchronous trick, whereby this function, get current position, will return immediately. Close paren, semicolon, called. But it will call my callback function when it's ready to give me the GPS coordinates, which could be a second, a minute, an hour later. That function, when called, takes an argument called position. It turns out, and I figured this out by reading the documentation, inside of the position, as returned by this function, as passed by this function, is another property called coordinates, inside of which, more specifically, is a latitude coordinate and a longitude coordinate. So by accessing latitude and longitude and just concatenating them with a comma and a space, I get that very simple prompt that we saw a moment ago. So it's as simple as that. But we can refine this a little bit. Let me open up geolocation 1, which looks like it has the same behavior. But if I view the page source this time, what have I done differently? I'm sort of learning from past mistakes or reapplying past improvements. What's different fundamentally about this example? It's not undefined. So this we had before, though. Yeah, so I have a lambda function, an anonymous function, a nameless function where here, so what function name did I used to use? Literally callback. It could have been called anything. I just called it a callback. But if it's a callback whose purpose in life is to get called once in only one location and never again, why am I wasting time confusing me and subsequent readers of the code with multiple functions? Just put it where I want it. Now notice, function, open paren, close paren, position. So I'm still taking the same arguments. I'm just not bothering to give it a name. Then I call the alert. And I have to be careful. Notice I have open paren, close paren. So those are balanced. Open curly brace. So down here, I have to remember to close the curly brace, close the close paren. So that's the only price you pay and just a bit of syntactic potential for confusion. All right, it's pretty cool what you can do with the browser. Questions? All right, let's do one last big feature that'll take us home here. So here I have an example called Ajax0.html. I said a moment ago, Ajax is asynchronous JavaScript and XML, though that's kind of a white lie these days because it doesn't always, and if ever, use XML these days. What does it do, Ajax, for us? So let's synchronously load data from servers or asynchronously. So both, actually. So the A means asynchronous, but you can run it in both modes. And it looks like this, which is a wonderful picture, which makes this super simple. Oh, it's actually pretty simple once we look at it. So here we go. Ajax is just a technique. It is the application of built-in features of JavaScript to programmatically get more data from a web page after the original web page is loaded. So we've seen this for years, thanks to things like Google Maps. For instance, when you click and drag on a Google map, before you see more of the Earth, you often see little gray tiles, gray squares, before those portions of the map have downloaded. But thanks to Ajax, the code Google wrote in JavaScript can ask google.com, give me more tiles, give me more tiles. Sometimes that takes a few seconds if the network is slow, and that's why those tiles only gradually appear. Twitter and Facebook and Gmail and GChat, all of these tools that you might use that update themselves over time are using Ajax to go get more data. Rewind 10, 15 years when you had sites like MapQuest, which still exists, and I think you still use it in the same way. When you click the up arrow or the down or the left or the right arrow to move the map, it would reload the whole darn page. That's before the days of Ajax. So Ajax lets us create the illusion of dynamically changing content without having to force reload some whole page. All right, so here's a picture that makes it less clear. So we have a user interface, namely the browser, use some JavaScript in step 1. And this is actually worth knowing, or at least tucking away. The feature of JavaScript that makes this possible is called an XML HTTP request object. So much like we saw geolocation, much like we saw the local storage, this is another keyword introduced to JavaScript a few years ago that allows us to make these asynchronous calls back to the server. All right. Once you have instantiated one of those objects, as we'll see, you send an HTTP request to the server. Can't do that anymore. Send an HTTP request to the server. It responds years ago with XML data, and occasionally still today. And then your JavaScript code parses this thing called XML. If unfamiliar, XML is like homemade HTML. It's make your own tags, make your own attributes. But there's a simpler format these days called JSON, JSON, which is more popular and lighter weight. So when you get this XML back, you then do something with it. So this is a cryptic 5-step way of explaining how Google and Facebook and GChat and Twitter go about dynamically updating their DOMs without reloading the whole page. They're just making more HTTP requests across the wire. And we can probably see this. What might be, let's see if I can pick a site that without logging in would do this for us. What is a site that could do this? Google Live Stream? No, that doesn't work.
Probably go to someone's Twitter page and just wait for it to
Twitter.
like,
Yeah.
based on a hashtag on our page.
Who's a famous well, no, that won't work. We need someone. Almost every site on the internet does this today, and I can't think of one.
Just go to Twitter and find some trending topic.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. What's trending? Let's choose something acceptable. Oh, only I am seeing the material. There we go. All right. What's happening right now? What's popular today? News. All right, 5 hours ago or 3 minutes ago. Well, let's see. There must be some aspect here. Let's see if we can cheat. This is a horrible demo. Okay, so let me fake the story, and then I'll come better equipped. I will stop doing spontaneous demos is what I'll do. So what I did was I opened the same tool that we opened earlier, which is Chrome's Inspector tab. And again, Safari and IE and Firefox have these same kinds of tools. And oh, there we go. And I clicked on the Network tab because, as I expected, we would have this little row appear here. And if we waited long enough, so what happened is apparently Twitter's JavaScript code is making an AJAX call every half a minute, however often that's going to flash on the screen. And if I hover on this, you can see that the URL that was requested was this long one here, twitter.com/i/search. And that is because Twitter instantiated one of those XML HTTP request objects and just made an HTTP request from the client-side JavaScript code that I downloaded a minute ago back to their servers, presumably checking for more tweets. And there might not be new tweets, but they're at least polling their servers to check for it some amount of time. And indeed, if I click on this request, we won't go into much detail here on this, but you can see all of the HTTP headers. You can see exactly what came back in the response. Apparently, there were more items. There's a key called has more items. So Twitter is actually using JSON, JavaScript object notation, instead of XML. But any site, if you are a Facebook user, Gmail, GChat user tonight, use Chrome, log into one of those websites, and just watch the Network tab of the Chrome Inspector, and you'll see pretty constant traffic. Certainly if there's a busy site or if you're chatting back and forth with friends, you'll see all of these HTTP requests. This is arguably what makes the web or web development really interesting these days, in that you can make much, much more dynamic sites as a result. So this site, as we'll see, allows me to get a stock quote. Let me type in something like GOOG, which is the ticker symbol for Google, get quote, and there's an error with the AJAX call. So why might this be? So let me go back over here to my, let's see how to do this. Let's open AJAX-0. That's why. Typo. GOOG, get quote. There we go. So I renamed the file earlier and forgot to change it in the HTML. So apparently, as of 4:30 p.m. or so today, the Google stock price is $869.79. So I did not know that in advance, though technically I could have just hard-coded this, I suppose, after 4:30 p.m. for a 6:30 class. But this was, in fact, fetched dynamically. And if you use the same demo tomorrow morning, you would get a different answer slightly. And certainly for other websites, we could get back different stock quotes. So let's see how this is working underneath the hood. If I view the page source, let's scroll down to the easier part first. There's some HTML at the bottom. And it's really just a super simple form that borrows some of the lessons learned from earlier. On submit, call what function? Quote. This isn't a built-in function. This is apparently one I wrote up above that we'll look at in a second, return false so that it doesn't actually submit to the server in the traditional way. So AJAX is all about sending data to the server. It's just I don't want it to be submitted via that form per se. I want it to be submitted via my code, my event handler up above. So this symbol is an input. Autocomplete is off. It has an ID of, let's scroll to the right, quote-unquote symbol. That's probably going to be useful. So I can uniquely identify what the user typed in. So let me zoom out and scroll back up. And you're going to see some mess of a code. And here, too, jQuery will make our lives better. So at the top of my script tag, I have a variable called XHR. Could have called it anything, XML HTTP request, initializing it to null, just so that the variable exists for me. Down here, I have a function called quote with some simple comments above it to remind me. And now we have kind of a mess of code that, again, is dramatically simplified by libraries. But I'm going to try to instantiate a new XML HTTP request object. If something goes wrong, something called an exception is going to be thrown. The browser specifically, if it has no idea what this symbol is, XML HTTP request, because I'm using Netscape 1.0 or many versions of IE, it will throw an exception that I am prepared to catch. If I do catch it, I am going to reasonably, but not definitively, assume that it's what browser? So there's a lot of this kind of code on the internet because IE 6 and 7 and 8 and 9 to some extent have not always played so nicely with certain standards. And all the browsers kind of cut corners here and there. But this is just an example of error checking code. And what jQuery will do for us in just a few moments is collapse all of this messiness and all of this care about what browser the user's using into a simple function call. But what's really going on underneath the hood is something like this. So this is raw JavaScript code. I proceed to check if the XHR object is null, then I'm going to return an alert saying AJAX is not supported in your browser, but we didn't see that. And then down here, I'm going to do just a little bit more work to make this magic happen. I'm going to declare a variable called URL, whose value is quote.php. It happens to be written in PHP, but that's just because it's a language I know. I'm running it on a PHP-supported server. XAMPP comes with support for PHP. Question mark symbol equals, and then what am I concatenating on is the value of that URL, its parameter, whatever the symbol's value is that the user typed into the DOM. So the only thing new in this example besides the exception handling stuff is the fact that I'm using PHP, but we're not even going to look at the PHP code. Just know that it's returning dynamically a price using some PHP code talking to Yahoo Finance in real time. Yes, we will simplify all of this code in a moment with jQuery to get rid of most of these lines. So the last thing I need to do is actually contact the server. All I've done thus far is create a string, a variable, that is a URL. Now I need to do something with that URL. So I need these 3 lines. My XHR object, which again is my sort of gateway to the server for this feature called AJAX. Horrible property name, on, ready, state, change. What am I going to call? Call my handler function. So in a moment, we'll see a function called handler. And this is just my way of saying, hey, special object, when you change state, when you turn on, when you turn off, call this function so I can check what's going on, is what that boils down to. Open is opening a TCP connection to the server, HTTP specifically connection using the get method if familiar. If not, don't worry. It's the opposite of post. To this URL, making the call asynchronous. Asynchronous means this function will return immediately. And handler will get called when the server, if the server eventually replies. By contrast, if we made this false and said make the open call synchronous, that would mean that this function open would not return until the server answered back to me, which is not what we want. We don't want the whole page to lock up just in case the server is slow. Finally, send null just means I have no more arguments, no post data, just send the request. So some number of milliseconds, seconds, minutes, hours later, the handler function will get called because the state of this object will change just because the network responds, the server responds with an answer. What does handler do? It's pretty straightforward. It first checks this, and you would only know this from looking in the documentation, if the ready state value of the object is 4. So there's literally a cheat sheet. 4 is good. 4 means the whole thing is done. The request went, it came back, it's been examined, and it's ready for you. If you're in request state 4 and the server's response was 200, 200 is the opposite of something like 404, 403, 401, 500 error codes that if you ever see them are bad. 200 is one you never see because it's good, literally OK. The request worked. Then go ahead and alert the user with a window to xhr.response_text. And again, you'd only know this from looking at the documentation. Response text is the value of whatever the server spit out. And in this case, all the server spit out was $800 and some odd, just a super simple text string. In the case of Google Maps, it would have spit out a ping or a JPEG or a GIF. In the case of Facebook, it would have spit out a status update. In Twitter, it would spit out a tweet, and so forth. In this case, it's just a stock price. So how can we simplify this code? Well, let me go into a slightly cleaned up version. Yeah. Oh, sure. It was just a stupid mistake on my part. If I go into the source of Ajax-0, you'll have to fix this as well. And I'll fix this tonight online and re-upload the file. I had accidentally called the file quote1.php, but it's actually quote.php. I renamed it earlier. So I'll fix that permanently. Ajax1.html. So here is a version that we have not looked at its source code, but you can kind of guess that this is a little better. In what sense is this example about to be better designed? Yeah. Yeah. No annoying alert. We're kind of doing something that approximates the idea of what Twitter and Facebook do, is that they update the DOM. They change the contents of the web page itself by inserting new data dynamically. So where I say to be determined, let's hope that's actually true. First, let me look at the source and make sure I didn't mess up the file name. It's OK. I did correct this one earlier. So now if I type in goog, get quote, the page has dynamically updated itself. If I reload the page, notice it goes back to its defaults. And now let me show you one other feature of Chrome's inspector. And again, different browsers have this in different forms. I'm going to go ahead and control-click or right-click on the word determined, or really anywhere in that area. I'm going to click Inspect Element. And notice what happens. By default, I'm already on this Elements tab. But if and I'll zoom in a moment, if I choose Inspect Element, notice that the browser very helpfully expanded the HTML in this Inspector tab and highlighted the actual HTML that I asked it to inspect. So no matter how messy your HTML is, which it shouldn't be, this inspector shows you everything beautifully hierarchically, essentially giving you a navigable version of the DOM. This is the tree, and it's indented exactly as it should be to convey the notion of hierarchy. So watch what happens now. It's going to be a little small, so I'm going to do it this way. I'm going to type in GOOG. I'm not going to hit Enter or Submit yet. I'm going to scroll down to the bottom here. And now I'm going to hit Enter while this is on screen. And what do you expect should happen to the actual DOM, which, again, the inspector here is showing me? It should actually change. That rectangle's value should be changed from to be determined to $800 something. So here we go. Enter. And indeed, it actually changed. So this probably didn't take much effort because we're just replacing the alert function with something slightly more elegant. And indeed, if I go into my handler function, notice there's only one real change. I've replaced my alert line with this guy here. Document.getElementById of quote-unquote price. But wait a minute. We haven't seen a price ID before. But you can probably infer. Where is it probably? The text. Which text? The to be determined. So let's actually go to the HTML, because I must have made some other change here. Oh, interesting. So price colon. It does say to be determined, and there was a boldface tag, but I also wrapped it with an inline element, a span element, which is like a div, but it doesn't force a line break. And I gave it arbitrarily, but usefully, an ID at value of price so that I can uniquely identify that string there. So now up above, let's see what the rest of this line is. Get element by ID of price dot inner HTML. So there's different ways of doing this, and this is somewhat of the kludgy approach. The right way to do this would be to create a new text node, to remove the old text node, insert or append the new text node, and it would take 3 lines of code. It actually tends to be slower, at least if you're doing this for lots of nodes in a DOM like a Facebook or a Twitter does. Inner HTML literally just says cram the new content where the old HTML should be without actually parsing it like DOM objects. So this gets the job done here. If I scroll to the right, I'm just pushing the response text, the $800 string, into the innermost HTML of that span, which is why we saw the DOM element update a moment ago. So if we do it again to recap now with that context, and I pre-type in Goog, I don't hit enter yet, but I instead scroll down to where it says to be determined, is the span tag going to be replaced or the bold tag? Just the bold tag, because when I uniquely identify the span element by its ID, called price, and change its inner HTML, that won't blow away the span tag itself, just its inner HTML, which is apparently a bold-faced tag and a line of text to be determined. So if I hit enter, sure enough, that changes. It would be somewhat counterproductive if the act of updating the span tag with the unique ID of price has the effect of blowing away that span tag with the unique ID, because then I could never update it a second time, maybe a minute or so later if I actually did this in a loop with a timer. All right, let's clean this up ever so slightly more. In ajax2.html, if I view the source here, notice that I've done away with quote.php. The one thing I don't like about those previous two demos is that it requires that I be running a web server that supports PHP, that I have written in advance a file called quote1.php, and that 3, the reader knows something about PHP to actually look at it. In reality, it's a super short file. It's not hard to understand, but it's still a dependency. If the whole point, at least of this portion of the course, is to do client-side development and not have to get tied down to some language like Java or Python or Ruby or PHP, it'd be nice if we can eliminate my PHP dependency altogether. Now, the catch is that there's a problem. Yahoo, as I said before, is the one supplying the data. Long story short, Yahoo Finance lets you grab data in CSV format, sort of poor man's Excel format, which is nice because it's just text, and I can parse it by splitting on the commas that separate the values. The problem, though, is that because of a policy called the same origin policy, when you write JavaScript code and you query a server like Yahoo for data using JavaScript, Yahoo can reply to you and give you that stock price, but you are not allowed typically to do anything with the value that involves manipulating your DOM. In other words, if you have a DOM from your own server, from the HTML, and you're running some JavaScript code that talks to Yahoo, and Yahoo says, here's a piece of data for you, you cannot add that piece of data to your own DOM. It sort of breaks a barrier that's meant to exist between your site and others so that certain threat scenarios don't necessarily arise. This is obviously kind of a problem. I worked around this in the first two examples by writing quote.php, who's a middleman, a proxy of sorts that gets the data from Yahoo, then replies to me, so that rather than the data going Yahoo to browser, it's going server, Yahoo, server, browser. But now I'm this middleman. God forbid my server goes down. Now my website won't even work in terms of the PHP code. So it's just an unnecessary barrier. Not to mention it requires code that I write on the server. It'd be really nice if I could just talk to Yahoo. Some companies allow you to grab their data via JSON-P format, JavaScript object notation padded format. This is just a fancy way of saying it's a different type of JSON. We've seen JSON briefly in the browser, but it's actually super simple. You may recall from earlier that what is the syntax for an array? If I have an array, we'll call it foo. In JavaScript, how do I give myself an empty array? Square brackets. How do I give myself an array containing the number 42? Like this, 42, 43, 42, 43, 44. So it's just as you would expect in most any similar language. What about now an object? An object in JavaScript is just the incarnation of a hash table, an associative array, a dictionary, a collection of key value pairs. The syntax for an empty one is this. How do we have key value pairs? We only briefly glimpsed this earlier, but you do it in this form, key, value. And if you want another one, key 2, value. And this is a bit of an oversimplification. To be super proper, JSON keys and values need to be quoted, even though this is a pain in the neck. It's not strictly necessary in JavaScript. It is necessary in JSON. So this now is a collection of 2 key value pairs. So what if I want to get back an array of objects? I could get back an array of key, this is going to get tedious quickly, value, key 2, value. We'll stop there. So you can combine these basic syntactic constructs to come up with arrays of objects, objects with arrays inside of them, and so forth. This is essentially JSON. It's JavaScript object notation. So when Google sends back data, when Twitter sends back data, when Facebook sends back data, they're not usually using XML, which looks like HTML these days. They're using this because it's much lighter weight and more compact, among other reasons. So what's the point here? Well, if Yahoo Finance were spitting out not just JSON, but padded JSON, I could work around the same origin policy. And we won't dwell too much on the details, but padded JSON means that the data coming back from a server can be embedded into your website. As you'll see in the first project, the spec for which we'll release online on Wednesday, there is a service that is coincidentally made by Yahoo called YQL, Yahoo Query Language, that simply allows you to query websites like Yahoo Finance, Facebook, Google, Twitter, any website on the internet. And if they expose their data as JSON data or XML data, Yahoo Query Language will allow you to fetch that data, and it will wrap it in this modified version of JSON called padded JSON, so that you can integrate the results into your own page. So this will become much more clear in the project spec. But for now, notice that the solution is as simple as a URL that looks like this. So this URL, though, notice, hits Yahoo, their YQL server. Notice that if I really look hard in here, you can also see finance.yahoo.com mentioned. So this is essentially a URL. It took me a couple minutes to construct, and they have a little GUI that helps you figure out what the syntax should be. But this just is a URL that's going to tell Yahoo's query service to go ask Yahoo Finance for a stock quote, then return it to me in padded JSON format. And the only difference with padded JSON is that whereas Twitter a moment ago returned to us a string that looked like this, padded JSON would literally return something that looks like this, so that you are tricking the server effectively into returning a snippet of JavaScript code that looks exactly like a function call. And so long as I, the developer, have written a function called callback or whatever it is, my data will get passed to that function, thereby circumventing the story that I've told, even though we haven't tripped over it ourselves. And again, you'll deliberately encounter this in the first project, and this is why you'll be using YQL to get data back from a server so that you don't have to use PHP or Python or Ruby or Java or anything in the appliance. All of your code will be client-side, and you won't run afoul of this restriction. But we promise to simplify this. So our last touch to this Ajax example, which still works the same, Goog, pops up the $800. If I view the page source, notice that I can now simplify my code as follows. I'm still using this longer URL, but that's just so that I'm avoiding the same origin issue. I could change this back to quote.php. Here is how in jQuery I can get a quote. I call $.ajax. So this looks a little weird, but again, remember that the $sign is just shorthand notation for a function called jQuery. So this is jQuery.ajax. As is common in JavaScript, as you'll see with various libraries online, many functions take not a comma-separated list of arguments as their values. They often take an object of key-value pairs so that the order does not matter. It's just a nice convention. Perl does this a lot, and Python can do this, and other languages. So this is saying one of the keys being passed into this method is called data type, quote-unquote JSON-P. I'm just telling jQuery what response to expect back. The URL has a value of URL, and that's it. There's a little bit of magic. Turns out, and this is just to pave the way for the first project, notice that somewhere in this long URL, I have told Yahoo that my callback function will be called handler, the name we've used before. So jQuery is actually, and this is one of these hidden features, well, it's in the documentation, but it's not obvious. jQuery, if it notices that you are contacting a server with a parameter whose value is callback equals something, jQuery will very nicely assume that, oh, when I get a response from this URL, I'm going to call your function called handler, which just means that we're on the honor system here. I just have to make sure to implement this thing just like I did before. So handler expects a response. I happen to know by reading Yahoo's documentation, if the response object has a query property, has a count value of 1, that means I got back 1 stock price. And it took some trial and error to figure out what the server was sending me, but I figured out that it should equal 1. And when that happens, I should output response.query.results.row.price. Very convoluted number of steps to get to that point. But again, you'll see in the first specification of the project exactly what that's doing and why it's doing it. Questions on, I know that was a lot. Questions on Ajax, having just started JavaScript an hour ago.
When the server calls a callback function, can it also pass the status value?
Yes, when the server calls the callback function, it passes in the response argument. Also tucked away in that response argument, which I didn't bother using this time, are the 200 and details like that. Because jQuery similarly checks those kinds of things for me, so I don't have to worry as much about it. All right, so that was jQuery. So that only leaves a semester of Objective-C. So Objective-C, as we will see, is much more mind-bending, at least at first for most people, than JavaScript. But rest assured that this coming week, on Wednesday, we'll have our first labs with RJ and Rob. It'll be an opportunity to dive in hands-on with some of this code. And some of you seem to be following along with some of it. But we'll look at other examples that apply these same concepts. And we'll also give you a tour of the first project, which will involve mashing together some location information, some weather, some news, some HTML, some JavaScript. And we'll leverage concepts like Ajax and the like, but won't necessarily go into as much detail as some of these things here. And you'll see the Spec 2 will hold your hand through a tour of some of these concepts and technologies that might be unfamiliar. And 2 weeks hence, in the Lab 2, we'll also offer another opportunity to explore that material and specifically explore the project, for which there are roughly 2-week deadlines, as you can see in the course's syllabus, which is at CS76.net. But very quickly, we'll be transitioned to Objective-C. So what we'll do next Monday, when we return for lecture, and I unfortunately have to be at a conference, Rob will be leading us on Monday, we'll be diving into Objective-C itself. For those unfamiliar, Objective-C is a superset of C. For those unfamiliar with C, we will give you a crash course on Monday in C, and everything you need to know about memory management and pointers and the syntax thereof, so that we can focus really on the OO features of Objective-C, and then transition toward the end of next week, or rather the start of week 3, to the iOS SDK, Software Development Kit. And even though next week we'll spend some of our time in Xcode and or at the command line, ultimately we'll spend most of the semester in a tool that looks like this. I've opened up most of the panels for this particular screenshot, but Xcode, which is Apple's integrated development environment, similar in spirit to NetBeans or IDE or similar tools, if you're familiar, is kind of designed to make programming fun and look like iTunes, such that once you write your program, all you do is hit play and everything just works nicely in the simulator, or if you connect a USB cable, it will burn the software onto your device if you so choose. But through this environment, we'll use Objective-C. We'll use a tool called Interface Builder that allows you to construct fairly simple but fairly quickly user interfaces that are very similar in spirit to iOS 6's paradigm. You'll be then able to compile and run them in the simulator, or if you have a device, again, we'll set you up with that. A word on iOS 7. The tragedy of a summer course, in the tragedy of WWDC, which is Apple's conference, which always happens like 2 weeks before the semester begins, is that they always start to they announce that things are changing, and then they actually change like 2 months later. So we're in this sort of weird limbo state. But thankfully, there's nothing. Most of the changes in iOS 7 are aesthetic so far as we would be concerned for a class like this. Underneath the hood, there's new functionality, there's some new methods, there's some new constants and the like, but nothing that will fundamentally change any of the things we do over the next 6 to 7 weeks. So you can rest assured legitimately with this transition to iOS 6 and 7 that everything we explore will continue to apply. That wasn't the case from iOS 5 to 6, where some fundamental aspects of Objective-C itself were altered. So if you're a bit worried about that, rest assured that we'll be okay. And the transition to iOS 7 should be a fairly smooth one for you if you take things further. Beyond that, we will ultimately start in a couple weeks' time with the simplest of Hello World applications, and then go much, much beyond that. That's it for tonight. I'll stick around for questions with Rob or RJ. Otherwise, we will see you on Wednesday across the hall in B108. See you then.